Hello, everyone, and again, welcome to this Contemporary Women's Writing and the Medical Humanities International Online Conference. I'm going to speak for a bit, and then people will come in. So my name is Claire Gentilly. I am a white French woman with light brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a kind of blue, weird green shirt. I'm also a PhD student in medical humanities in France, so I am very much delighted to be moderating this panel on unexplained illness. So today we'll be listening to Catherine Cheston. Hi, Catherine. And to Sakshi Srivastava. Hello, Sakshi. Alex Henry was supposed to present his work today too, but unfortunately he's unable to join us due to illness. So we do hope he gets better soon, and I really hope we'll be able to hear or read his work soon as well. That being said, let's start this panel. So I'm going to present you Sakshi. You are a researcher in the Department of English at Banaras Hindu University, India. You are working in the field of critical medical humanities, focusing on the relationship between narratives and the experience of illness. You have published online in Café des Senses blog and Borderless journal. Today, your paper is entitled Debating Inexplicability of Pain in Selected Women's Poetry. Over to you.
So my name is Sakshi Srivastava, and I am a PhD research scholar in the Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, India. And I'm working in critical medical humanities, broadly focusing on the relationship between narratives and illness. And I'm a 26-year-old Indian woman with short black hair, and I'm in a yellow kurti, and my background is a little pink and a little blue. So I'll start. The title of my paper is Debating Inexplicability of Pain in Selected Women's Poetry. This paper consists of a working idea that deals with a few things. First, that language and pain are not opposites, but rather complicatedly intertwined phenomena. Is there anything I should know about? Hello?
No, it's all right. I guess it was just sound in the background of someone's computer. Don't worry.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay, so it deals with a few ideas. First, that language and pain are not opposites, but rather complicatedly intertwined phenomena. So the inexplicability of pain that I'm talking about here might emerge from the reception of this expression in language. Second, that problem, the problem that we are talking about might not be the medical inexplicability alone, but also the reception as a lived experience, something that has culturally contingent positions. This distinction comes not only from the medical understanding of pain and suffering, but also the biocultural and extra-medical understanding that is situated in the lived experience of an individual's life. So this lived experience is also a phenomenological phenomena that we will later deal with. Third point, that this biocultural and phenomenological experience cannot be understood without accommodating the idea of womanhood or gender into it. So we know that historically women have been seen as more prone to the relation between power and mechanisms of power, right? Okay, I don't know what I said, sorry. So women's experience has been more marked by the mechanisms of power in the society. And fourth, that these pieces come from specific historical and cultural locations with their individual experiences of pain. So in their particular ways, they work to subvert the roles that are usually associated with women in pain. So to begin with, the complicated human experience of pain is not merely a bundle of neurochemical reactions with physical objects of reference. It is an event that affects the physical, mental, and emotional well-being to such an extent that one is unable to continue one's life in any previously understood manner. David Biro defines pain as an all-consuming, eternal experience that threatens to destroy everything except itself. So pain becomes a reason and a site for utter chaos. It might ensue what Arthur Frank calls a chaos narrative, a narrative that usually lacks coherence and a sense of narrative order, and does not move towards the restitution of health or a quest for a newer meaning of life. And it's different from restitution narratives and quest narratives that Frank talks about. So illness, and specifically pain that we're talking about, is an unfamiliar and frightening event because it affects our existence in unique ways. Ferber says it affects our existence so much that our mode of being is constituted by it, profoundly marked and distinguished by its ever-present constraint. Pain is foreign and alien, at the same time, internal and intimate. Pain is characterized by its destructiveness and isolation, and it also affects our intersubjective exchanges in language, consequently, our relation with the other person. Ellen Scarry also suggests that there is always doubt and certainty about the same phenomenon in pain. So the sufferer's pain might be the only certain thing in their lives, but the outsider might not even believe in it. So pain, its effects and its meanings might be simply invisible to the other people. So it also defies representation. It also resists representation. So historically, it used to embody a kind of mysticism and positive value to itself. But ever since the mechanical analogies of pain came into existence, the idea of repairing or fixing the machinery of body also came into being. Burke says, in earlier periods, doctors regarded pain stories as crucial in enabling them to make an accurate diagnosis. But now pain narratives were stripped of any deeper significance. So chemical and neurological tests replace stories, and statistics replace language. So how do we understand pain as an inexplicable phenomena is quite interlinked with how we see it in medicine, the medical inexplicability of pain, or not the medical inexplicability, but how it's medically unapproved or approved by medicine. So when we talk about the inexplicability of pain, there are a few contentions. First, is pain a problem of language? So in other words, does language become inadequate in pain? Or what Virginia Woolf calls the poverty of language. She says, and I quote, "The merest schoolgirl, when she falls in love, has Shakespeare, Donne, Keats to speak her mind for her. But let a sufferer try to describe pain in his head to a doctor, and language at once runs dry. There's nothing ready-made for him. He's forced to coin words for himself, taking his pain in one hand and a lump of pure sound in another," unquote. So basically, she problematizes the scarcity of language that can describe the subject in illness and, by extension, in pain. This pain severs our intersubjective connections, complicating the relationship between the sufferer and the other. So it is also considered to alter the fundamental features of human existence, our usage of language, as it turns it into non-human utterances and animal cries. But the picture might not be this simple, because there cannot simply be an objective, universal, evidence-based way to acutely describe and attend to individual realities of pain. As Jean E. Jackson describes, a painful body occupies a world different from the other worlds. So the question arises, is there an exclusive opposition between language and pain, or is there a common interconnectedness between them? So language can act as a barrier with regards to illness and can also dismantle those barriers. Martha Stoddard Holmes suggests that we must focus on not the world unmade through language, but the world remade in pain through language. So expressions in language can act as sites where the world unmade can be reconstructed. So the question is, does the problem reside in the language or the listener and the reception? To explore this, we must look at medical gaze and how it affects the reception of the expressions of pain in medicine. So the Cartesian idea of body's mechanism foregrounds pain as being a reaction to a stimulus. This idea also contributed to the understanding of pain as a blank and isolated event which did not acknowledge any other meaning or social context. So Frank suggests that pain creates an ontological divide between the people who experience it and the others, thus highlighting their separatedness. This ontological divide, along with modern medicine's reliance on evidence-based practices, leads to a scarcity of acknowledging the sufferer as an alternative and valid source of information about pain. Since pain is always a subjective experience, we cannot simply be done with this individual subjective experience of pain as an undesirable variant in analysis of pain. And subjectivity is never truly private and individual, because individual human beings exist only within the individual framework of, intersubjective framework of specific cultures. So pain here includes the culturally created and reinforced meanings that a person might be suffering. So differences in biology and in cultural roles make gender an important influence on pain. Like we had so many examples. We have Victorian women whose pain were dismissed, thinking of them as imaginary. We have, even now we have experiences of individuals who say that practitioners told them that it's all in your head, it's not real, like Catherine was mentioned as well. So this leads me to the medical conception of suffering body versus a more wholesome understanding of the body in pain, or the lived body in pain. So the medical understanding is the body object, and the more wholesome understanding, where we consider cultural elements as well, is the body subject. And for that, we will look into these three ideas. First, the biocultural model of pain. In The Culture of Pain, David B. Morris expresses concern that as biomedical epistemology has become the dominant framework for understanding health and illness, accounts of pain are valued for their contribution to diagnosis, not for their personal significance to the patient, family, or community. He says pain is not simply physiological or neurological, but it is biocultural, and it emerges only at the intersections of bodies, minds, and cultures. He says that pain has historical, psychological, and cultural dimensions, and meaning is often fundamental to our experience of pain. And of course, individuals and cultures have a powerful influence on this meaning, thus on our experience of pain. That leads me to the biopsychosocial model of medicine. This is a concept given by George Engel, and he says that medicine needs a more complete and inclusive conceptual framework. And that kind of change entails being attentive towards the psychological background, the social environment, and cultural factors related to the sufferer, along with the biomedical phenomenon of their pain. And thirdly, the lived experience of the suffering body self. This is a concept that is also given by Javi Carrel, and S.K. Toombs describes it in her book as well. And Toombs suggests that the medical understanding of the suffering body and the wholesome understanding of the lived body have a great difference. The medical understanding sees the pain in terms of the disease state that is entirely based in biology, anatomy, and pathology. But individual experience of pain might have other identifications, which come from one's cultural position. So these three basic contentions can be extended to the subjective experience of pain as intertwined with womanhood. Now, together with the experience of pain lies the lived experience of womanhood, where pain is not only familiarized, but is doubly constraining. So this experience of pain in the context of womanhood has varying sociocultural and political connotations to it. For example, for somatic symptom disorder, for chronic fatigue syndrome, or even irritable bowel syndrome, we have examples where people aren't believed, and people their social, political, and cultural background isn't being considered. So for somatic symptom disorder, the most common symptom is pain, something that might not be described, might not be explained by biomedicine about its origin and where it comes from. But research shows that women vastly outnumber men among its sufferers, and a large percentage of women with this kind of pain report childhood incidents of sexual abuse. This might be an isolated case, but we know that historically in medicine, women have suffered more than men due to the effects of the cultural roles and social positions ascribed to their gender. This embodied gendered subject is always a site for mechanisms of power to act on. One's embodied experience is always mediated by power. And for this, I'll bring sociologist Veena Das, who talks about violence in the bodies of women during the partition of India and Pakistan. But what she says basically is that every lived experience of these women also has a distinct individual context. So she expands that as readers, we must see these expressions of pain as social, contingent, and meaningful, and in specific local situations. This experience is vertically and hierarchically positioned, as well as horizontally and spatially situated. She says that expressing pain might be the issue of acknowledgement and not knowledge. So their expressions might not be cries for help, but cries for acknowledgement. And she says that the construction of pain in language, or the remaking of the world, involves attending to the pain in ways that take into account its full historical and social complexity. And it is this reconstruction that we'll focus on next. So I'm taking 3 poems total. First is Meds by Cynthia Huntington. So usually these linguistic expressions attempt to make visible supposedly invisible wounds as inscribed on the body and described in the words. These poems, in their particular ways, challenge the idea of endurance and acceptance related to the tolerance of pain among women. Where Angela Davis uses metaphors of struggle, war, cruelty, and violence, the internal threat of pain in Cynthia Huntington's Meds is complicated as the form shifts and changes along with the narrator, and incites the sense of floating and confusion. In Meds, it's a long poem, but I've selected a few parts and mark them red. So we see how the narrator herself feels unease in her body, and the subjugation of herself by the pain mirrors the hierarchies imposed upon womanhood. The destruction of oneself and a double alienation from one's body and the world can also be seen here, as she says, some foreign being in my brain giving orders, you must, you will. Huntington also talks about the pain vividly, explaining in non-biomedical terms, opposing, or let's say challenging, the objectivity of medicine and the unreliability associated with women's experience of pain. She takes charge of her own body and describes it on her own terms. She uses striking language to shake off the burdens of predefined, prescribed, and impersonal medical ways of expressing pain, and uses something that Jackson calls embodied communication that is antithetical to ordinary natural language. So, in Living with Pain, Davis juxtaposes the intimacy of individual pain with that of the universality of it. She also writes with a sense of solidarity in a consistent resistance to various systems of oppression. She uses images of being bound by its shackles, and yet she tries to express her struggles within those shackles. There's a need for surrender, yet a resistance to it. Rather than a medical explanation, we see the individual experience of pain here. And she addresses this pain as a she, and yet the limitations associated with her are still those of subjugation and submission in binary terms. She says, I'm riddled with the arrows that others aimed and that she pierces me with. This pain can also be seen as a mediator between other, possibly historical and socio-cultural forces beyond itself. I'm also taking one more poem because I found it quite relevant to this paper. So it's called Sequence in Hospital by Elizabeth Jennings. And she says, she describes the atmosphere inside the hospital as one of passivity and silence. So the healthy world is kept at a distance, and philosophies give way to subjective utterances about pain. It is hard to talk about pain, as she says, but she still talks about it, and she still represents this passive world via her poem. She says, I would like to shout, crash my voice into the silence, flout the passive suffering here. So these poems attempt to address the challenges of womanhood in pain, and most importantly, by writing about them on their own terms. They assert their embodied subjectivity against the normative perpetuated by patriarchy and the grand narratives of biomedicine. So to conclude, it is true that pain resists representation and closure, and this paper does not attempt to resolve the question of women's pain. Rather, it only attempts to see these poems to be a way of communicating the inexplicable individual experience of pain, and to persuade the audience and possibly the medical practitioner to acknowledge and, if possible, identify with them. As Elit Verber says, but pain, and in this case, writing about it, is also about creating an intimacy with others, turning towards them, listening, and being listened to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sakshi, for your paper. It was very interesting. So I guess we are going to start our Q&A now. So again, I remind you, you can raise your hand on Zoom, and you can also type in your question. If you don't want to open your mic, I can read them for you. So let's start. I was just wondering, hearing you talking about absence of community within the illness community, and also isolation, and Siksha was also talking about that. I was wondering, do you both in the texts you study for your different research see any kind of community within like the intertextuality, or maybe online? I know, Catherine, that you look at testimony. So what do you feel about this idea of community or in between community, or how does it work in what you look at, in the text you look at?
Yeah, so I'm not sure about online community as such, because like in case of Huntington, she's suffering from multiple sclerosis. So she's a recognized poet, I mean, because she was selected for certain prizes as well. So I'm not sure about the online community, but well, when we recognize women who are writing about situations and conditions like these, there's also a sense of solidarity between people who are recognizing them. So when we see somebody who has a difficult condition to be with, and when we see them out there speaking about something that is not being spoken about enough, I think that gives us a sense of solidarity and sense of community as well. So I'll probably look into what just Catherine described. I'll look into that link. So, yeah.
If anyone has any other question, or if even both speakers have question for one another, just go ahead. Otherwise, I wanted to maybe to go back on the topic of literary canon, and the fact that usually in many cultures, illness narratives are not really acknowledged as such as a great type of narrative. And I wanted to go back on that and to know if for both of you, the texts you study, what kind of reception you see from the readers and from the literary critic community on illness and the genres that have been chosen to express the illness experience.
What I understand is that within the English literary canon, I mean, such stories are now getting some sort of reception. I mean, now, as Catherine just said, it's getting reception within the patient community only. So it still has to cross that border as well. So people are writing from fringes, and people who are suffering, that is like a small percentage of us. Those are the readers as well. But I was also interested in the Indian way of approaching suffering as well. So we have melodies in Indian context as well. We understand things from Ayurvedic perspective and other perspectives as well. But there's still little reception and little acknowledgement of the fact that women are not just there to endure suffering and endure pain, because of childbirth, because of menopause, because of menstrual issues. We are supposed to think, I mean, people are supposed to think that they would suffer and they would be okay with it. but that still is like a problem within the Indian literary expressions, that we don't have as many texts that acknowledge how much women go through when certain issues appear. So yeah, I mean, it's still a problem, but yeah, within the patient community, within the people who are interested in it, there's reception as well, good reception.
Thank you. Yes, this is very interesting to hear. Linda was writing in the chat, thanks for great talks. I'm interested in the injustice against medical professionals in portraying them as homogeneous patriarchy, which ignores the lived experience and is focused on EBM. Practitioners are patients too. Have you encountered any wounded healer pain or mass narratives that challenge this injustice?
I can't remember anyone, like any woman who was written like that. But of course, in terms of all genders, we have sort of, okay, I remember one. There's one memoir, Girl Interrupted, must have heard of it. There's another called, it's by Redfield Jameson. I'm not, I can't recall the name. But there are memoirs from people who are practitioners of medicine. So Jameson is, I think, she's in psychotherapy or something. So she's in psychology herself, and she practices medicine. But she's also suffering from, I think, bipolar. Not really sure. So that too. I mean, there are narratives like that. I mean, they're not getting as much acknowledgement as they should get. Like in case of wounded healer among heterosexual men, we have, I think, Paul Kalanithi. He has written a memoir as well. It's not an unexplained illness, but he's also talking from a wounded healer perspective. So yeah, I mean, there are some examples, but the point is we need to understand that they too are fighting EBM, like evidence-based medicine, and that approach. They too are fighting that, because Kalanithi later on in his book realizes that when he was a doctor first, he had a different kind of experience within the same spatial location. But when he becomes a patient, he goes to the same operation theater, he goes to the same OPD and feels very, very differently. So, I mean, there are examples.
Thank you, Catherine and Sakshi, for your answers. And thank you also for all those sources you're sharing. I hope, Linda, this answers your question. And if anyone else has any question, I'm going to wait a little bit. Okay, so I think then that we can end our conversation here. Thank you very much, Catherine and Sakshi, for your papers and your answers too. But thank you also everyone who joined us today, and I hope you'll have a great experience during this conference. This was made possible thanks to Claire Burgess, who was our amazing panel producer today, but also thanks to Rebecca Rosenberg and Benjamin Dalton, who organized this whole conference. So I wish you a great day and great conference. See you.
Yeah, welcome everybody to panel 2C, Textual Narratives of Cancer. We have 4 very exciting panelists today, and I'm going to be introducing them, and they will give 15 minutes presentation. And at the end of all of the 4 presentations, we are going to have a Q&A session. So you can either drop your questions in the chat, or you can also message me privately, and then I will read the questions out for you. Or after the presentation, you can, or at the end of the presentations at the Q&A session, you can just raise your hand or unmute yourself. Yeah, I think with housekeeping, you should all be good by now. So please mute yourself during the presentations so we don't have any background noise. Yeah, there's also housekeeping rules in the chat now. So yeah, we start with Caroline Verdier, who's going to be presenting her paper, Overcoming Hodgkin's Lymphoma, Anne-Françoise Nutet. Caroline Verdier is a lecturer in French at the University of Strathclyde, Glasgow. Her research interests include contemporary French and Francophone literature, in particular Belgian women writers. She's also interested in issues surrounding cultural identities in Francophone countries and currently works on contemporary Francophone illness narratives in relation to trauma and gender. She published several articles on women writers like Delphine de Vigan, Elisa Brun, and Amélie Nothomb, and co-edited several works, for example, Francographies in 2010, As Time Goes By, Portraits of Age 2013, and Solitaire, Solidaire, Conflict and Confluence in Women's Writing in French in 2015. So yeah, the floor is all yours, Caroline.
Thank you very much. So let me take care of the practical aspect first of a PowerPoint. Can you see the PowerPoint just now?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So that's the first part. And then I will quickly audio describe myself as we have to do. So I am a 40-year-old white female. I am blonde with green eyes and I'm wearing a black t-shirt and some silver jewelry. And before I start, I would like to thank Ben and Becky for putting together such a rich conference program and for enabling me to share my work in progress here, which is part of a larger project on illness narratives written by Francophone women writers. So let me stop the clock and then get on with it. So Anne-Françoise is let's try. Anne-Françoise is a lesser-known Belgian writer, despite the quality of her books. She had a versatile profile working as a teacher, as a short film director, TV program director, notably focusing on literary and medical topics. And she was also organizing creative writing workshops, and in parallel to that, she wrote 2 novels. She did not have time to become as prolific a writer as other household names in Francophone literature, as she passed away in 2006. But her novels focusing on cancer and autism, published respectively in 1991 and 1995, showed an interest in questions surrounding treatment and perception of medical conditions at a time when pathographies were becoming more established as a genre. Now, the novel under consideration today is Nu-Tête, which translates literally as naked head in English, and is a clear reference to the hair loss experienced by the character in the narrative as a result of cancer treatment. The cover, as you can see on the slide of the first edition, also leaves little doubt as about to the topic of the novel. The cancer the main character suffers from is one of the lymphatic system, then commonly known as Hodgkin's lymphoma, and was one of the first cancers to be treated successfully with radiotherapy and later on with chemotherapy. Now, despite the book being labeled as a novel, a roman, on the cover, and a statement that this is a work of fiction, and you have that on the slide. And by the way, all the quotations are in French, but I provided a translation in blue underneath each time if you don't understand French. So despite that, the statement that this is a work of fiction, it's hard not to make an obvious connection between Anne-Françoise, who was herself treated for Hodgkin's in 1991, and Cécile, the main character, who seemed very much modeled on the author sharing similar interests to her. So in this brief overview, I will focus on patient-doctor relationship and on the impact of illness on patient's identity. In Nu-Tête, Anne-Françoise depicts the experience of Cécile W., a 22-year-old whose passion is ballet and who is a few weeks away from a major audition when she is diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. The narrative follows a linear structure and details the various stages of Cécile's illness, along with the numerous tests and treatments she undergoes, a bit like a journal. And although the text focuses on Cécile's story, its originality very much resides in part in the fact that it is written from both her perspective and that of her oncologist, Dr. Van Ardois. And the text keeps switching between Cecile's monologue and that of the oncologist. And in between, on a regular basis, you also have inserted letters that are medical reports from the oncologist to the GP. The polyphony of the text is an interesting feature to reflect upon, and it's the first element that I would like to focus on. Where most pathographies, whether memoir, fiction, or autofictions, usually focus on one side of the illness account, Anne-Françoise gave a voice simultaneously to the doctor and to the patient, but the language that they use is very different and contributes to highlighting the gap between patients and doctors. Indeed, the reader does not necessarily feel that patient and oncologist are working together. Cecile describes the procedures that she undergoes and how she feels physically and mentally. No, I'm not going to read all the quotes for the sake of time, but you can read them here. So she's saying that de tous ces examens, je retiens un malaise pire que la douleur. Le mal est ponctuel, je peux lui faire face. But what we are retaining here is that je hais toutes ces pratiques qui vous privent de la souveraineté banale du bien portant. In turn, the doctor, Van Ardois, gives some very sensorial and technical descriptions of the treatment he administers Cecile. He treats her very impersonally in the medical context, very much reducing her to a body subjected to biomedical treatment. And there's little interest on his part as to how she feels mentally. Now, alongside the two perspectives, the reports Dr. Van Ardois sends to the GP that I've just mentioned offer a very instrumental, scientific, and almost documentary perspective on Hodgkin's disease and its treatment, as you can see on the slide. So it's typically how it is presented, and you can see here that there's a list of treatment like urography, lymphography, scintigraphy, and I put everything through Google Translate because I couldn't translate all the medical elements myself. So if there is any issue, apologies. Now, this dual perspective on the same object, the lymphoma, but from two different stances and three different level of discourse to describe it, provides different pictures to consider and almost oppose the medical practitioner's instrumental discourse to the lived reality and experience of the patient. In short, this literary strategy for grounding the medical procedures and medical gaze and objective medical records, in contrast with the patient's subjective experience of the symptoms and treatment, enabled Anne-Françoise, I would argue, to effectively illustrate the gap there was at the time between the doctor and the patient, a gap that was identified and criticized in the works of Anne Hunsaker-Hawkins and Arthur Frank and others as well in the 1990s, advocating a change in the way medicine treats patients. Now, whilst the piece never openly criticized the way the main character is treated by the medical practitioners, I think it illustrates quite vividly the imbalance of power in the relationship between the two. Besides the medical and more technical aspect of Van Ardois' relationship with Cecile, we also discover his fascination for the patient, and it's a bit unsettling, I would say, from the opening. And although he never shows anything to her, we learn that he has more than a medical interest in her. So he wants to cure her, but in the process, he wants to break her almost and to own her by the end of the novel. And it's something I don't have time to address here, but you can see the quote here when he really wants her to belong to him, body and soul. There is also an element that I don't have time to explore here, which is the location, the hospital, which obviously is the place described from the opening of the novel as the place where one's voice is muted and the place which transforms and affects the identity. And you can link back to Foucault and the birth of the clinic. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into that and move on to my second point, which is more looking into the identity renegotiation that the patient has to undergo. So in parallel to being confronted to the institutionalized medicine that I have just talked about, Cecile also has to deal with her changing body, which goes hand in hand with renegotiating her identity. Throughout the novels, she grapples with the pain and the trauma induced by the experiences of sickness, and Anne-Françoise in her account, Anne-Françoise's account, constitutes an effective illustration not only of patients' corporeal suffering, but also equally fits Arthur Frank's category of the chaos narrative that, I quote, is defined by the loss of control over the body and over the outcome, end of quote. As pointed out by Wilson and Hubble, I quote, illness disrupts the patient's sense of being in the world, body and perception react, affecting movement, ability, and human experience as a whole, end of quote. And throughout the book, Cecile's story illustrates all this as she undergoes the process of losing her identity as a healthy person and a dancer, very much in control of her body, to become a sick person. And this is the quote you have, the second quote on the slide. Je n'ai jamais été malade, je me targue de ma discipline qui n'est pas une contrainte, mais plutôt une nécessité. She gives up her independence and returns to live with her parents. And she also has to give up on a dream to integrate the prestigious ballet company and her career as a professional dancer. And that's the quote on the slide. Après des années d'efforts, j'arrête mon entraînement, j'abandonne, so I'm giving up here. She trains her capacity to endure physical pain from training to enduring it from the treatment. And this is the second quote. Apprivoiser la douleur me satisfait, ça ressemble à ce que je connais, l'effort, la volonté, la maîtrise. And she relinquishes this control to the oncologist, and it's the third quote on the slide. Je m'en remets au docteur Van Ardois, peu importe qui il est, ce qu'il me veut, comment il y arrivera, je ferme les yeux et je me laisse faire. Cecile's identity switches from active to very passive, as she submits to all the tests and medical procedures without ever questioning them or the effects on her, as if she's relinquishing ownership of her body and identity by entering to the realm of the sick, to make a reference to Other Lord here. This passivity and almost loss of agency echoes both Arthur Frank's observation that, I quote, the diagnosis set in place a treatment plan, and for this plan, only the patient's compliance, not necessarily her understanding, is required, end of quote. But also that of Unsaker Hawkins, who says, I quote, the model of patienthood, in biomedicine is one of passivity, end of quote. As already stated, Cecile's identity is tightly linked with her body as a dancer. And both are slowly deconstructed by the lymphoma and its treatment, turning the strong dancer into a sick person. She says, mon corps perd sa carapace de muscles, livré au sentiment de mon inconsistance, aligning with what Matthewsom and Stubbs have identified, I quote, as bodily disruption, which is a serious signal of discrepancy between the healthy and the ill person, end of quote. In addition to the aesthetics of the body, the aesthetics of the body is also at play here. This in-control body of the dancer meets the pathological language and the aesthetics of the medical body to become a medicalized body here, one which changes shape, the loss of muscle mass, the loss of weight, that we've just mentioned, but also the change of color that is induced by the use of methyl glue. And this is the second quote. Mon teint vire au gris, mes cernes au parme, mon corps m'est révélé dans des couleurs de boucherie, bleu cobalt et sang cru. And this change of appearance also goes further with the loss of hair, due to chemotherapy. And leaving Cécile to state, j'aurais voulu que personne ne me voie, que personne ne sache que je me désintègre, que j'erre en pièces détachées. So really much this disintegration of the body through treatment. These pictures that transpires of Cécile is now made up of not a picture as a photography, but as a mix of X-ray graphs and medical reports produced through the various tests that she undergoes, and which provide another kind of portrait of the character, one that is translated, I quote, into images, graphs, and numbers. As I just mentioned, the hair loss is also a key element of Cecile's journey and the visibility of her status as a sick person. The stigma associated with hair loss from chemotherapy and marking individual as cancer patients is well known. And this is one of the most striking elements in the physical changes experienced very often by patients. And you've got the quote here about the hair loss. Tout à l'heure, dans les toilettes des consultations, je me suis recoiffée à chaque geste des touffes de cheveux restées prises dans les dents du peigne. J'ai pensé devenir chauve en quelques minutes. Je suis quand même sortie les yeux rouges. So this pain of seeing the physical transformation of the body. So the reader witnesses Cécile negotiating her way through a treatment, changing body and disrupted life. And it is clear that her journey echoes Toom's view that, I quote, illness is experienced by the patient not so much as a specific breakdown in the mechanical functioning of the biological events, the biological body, but more fundamentally as a disintegration of our world. And I mentioned the word disintegration a few minutes ago. Cécile has to decide how the events of her illness now fit in amongst the other events of her life. And this renegotiating of her identity and her life inevitably entails revisions of her future plans. So when recovering, she ends up trading her ballet shoes for a pair of trainers and starts working in a bookshop. Sorry. The novel portrays this dichotomy actually between the old self before cancer and the one after cancer. But at the same time illustrates the importance of the, I quote, experiential side of illness as identified by Matthewsom. Now, to conclude, and I've got 10 seconds left, so I might just go over by 30 seconds. So to conclude, Anne-Françoise' narrative addresses some of the wider concerns of cancer patients, such as the transformation of the body, which often goes hand in hand with the loss of identity and the need to build a new one, along with the power relationship with doctors and the relationship with other patients and the others who are not sick. But I don't have time to touch on this today. This is part of a larger project. In other words, Anne-Françoise effectively illustrates how, as was observed by Wilson and Hubbell, how illness is not only an obstruction to health, but a phenomenon the patient lives through, one that disrupts the everyday experience and interactions, and one that gives meaning to identity and self, end of quote. So to finish back on to the title of my paper and this idea of overcoming the cancer, one can wonder why Anne-Françoise chose to use fiction for this narrative and not autofiction or memoir, which may have been seen as more compelling. Unlike some other writers who want to remain as close as possible to their experience, it looks like Anne-Françoise needed to distance herself from the illness, with time, as reinforced by the fact that it took her 10 years after illness to publish this book, but also through filtering the story with a layer of fiction. And as Anne Unsacker-Hawkins argues, pathography should be understood, I quote, as a reformulation of the experience of illness rather than a transparent medium, end of quote. And illness writing being such a complex genre shows us time and again that there is not just one way of sharing the experience and of overcoming the illness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And yeah, we now go over to our second speaker, who is Matthewsom, if I pronounced that name correctly. Otherwise, correct me. She's going to be presenting the She Wings of Cancer and Care, an autofictional narrative. After 15 years teaching at home and internationally, Janet is now in her final year of study for a PhD in creative writing at the University of Essex. Her project, an autofictional novel entitled The Cells, seeks to create a new discourse about cancer, narrativizing this disease through the prism of a carer. The Cells will be her second novel. That's it. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. Just to describe myself a little bit, I'm a 40-something woman. I'm white and British, and I have chin-length fair hair. And thank you, Caroline, for your presentation. I can see that there's definitely going to be some connections between what I'm saying here and your study. So I'm writing a novel, which is now in its latter stages. And as we go, I'm going to put up some extracts from it for you to just have a look at. Hopefully that will appear in a minute. And my novel is about caring for someone with terminal cancer. The idea of writing this novel came to me sitting by my husband's, he was having chemotherapy treatment. And Julia Kristeva was very much there in my mind at its conception. At the time, I was thinking about the abject, about fractured subjectivity, about loss, but her theories about poetic language, women, care, and disability have also become methodology in my creative practice, in what I hope is an unforced interweaving of ideas. The novel is an experimental auto-fictional narrative told in the first person. Its narrator is not just a caregiver, but someone who cares deeply, a wife. Polysemic aspects of care merge and mutate within her. At times, she cares so acutely, is so entwined, that subjectivities merge with a deliberate confusion of pronouns. At other times, however, she's worn down, distinct, and reluctant in her role. The trajectory of her story may not be smooth, her development never complete, but in this paper, I argue that her experience of care allows for a reinvention of love, and that caring for, loving someone with terminal cancer opens a gift, and that this gift, however unwanted it may seem at times, can effect a transcendence, a painful, what I'm calling wingedness. She is me, she isn't me. Her name is Julian. Deliberately unisex, the name has also been chosen because it calls to mind Julian of Norwich, who in the late 14th century desired bodily sickness so that she would be purged by the mercy of God and after living more to the worship of God because of that sickness. After falling ill and being close to death when she was 30 years old, Julian had 16 showings. And I think it's worth pointing out that the spelling of showings is archaic. It's spelt shewings, or visions, which became her book, Revelations of Divine Love. Unlike Julian of Norwich, my care narrator's experience of illness is only vicarious, but her unique position, I argue, can be similarly revelatory. Care's showings can be a means of growing she-wings. In order to make this argument, I'm going to marry some of Kristeva's recent theories about disability to Plato's ideas about love. Disability, Kristeva says, differs from other differences in that it confronts us with mortality. And through this confrontation, we are able to commune with an ultimate otherness. Although Kristeva is not speaking expressly about disease as disability, my care narrator, through caring for someone with cancer, is exposed to just such an otherness, a truth which lies outside of and beyond a self. Julian's husband, Alex, needs medical intervention for survival. His cancer, at times stable, is ultimately incurable. Mortality does not become a desensitizing norm for Julian, but she must continually live with it. To be truly at one with the singularity of a person in the situation of disability would, says Kristeva, be an articulation of the desire to overcome our greatest fear, that which confronts us at our limits as living beings. Julian may sometimes struggle to be truly at one with Alex's situation, and she may not always face head-on that which confronts her at her limits, but neither does she run from it. I acknowledge that there is perhaps a risk here that the experiences of her husband could in some way be reduced, even used, in order to effect a psychic transformation. However, I see the confrontation as a leveling, enabling the potentiality for an exchange on equal terms, beyond gender, beyond the fact of disability, on an irreducibly human playing field with a shared and irrefutable mortality. The abject in my novel helps to underline this mortality, and in doing so could be said to catalyse a transformation. Abjection, according to Kristeva, is that which disturbs identity, order, system, that which has no respect for borders, positions, rules. And when I confront the abject, she says, I am at the border of my condition as living being. Once her husband is diagnosed with terminal cancer, Julian enters a new way of living This is the world of the body, which can accurately be described as a collection of cells, trillions of cells. The abject body feeds into my narrative in the unfolding plot, and I use that term loosely because it's not a linear plot, but also in textual representations of biological processes, which often result in perversions of language. Julian wrestles with the abject, but she gains too. A new subjectivity, impaired but repaired, comes in part from constantly living with an awareness of the fragility of the body. But Julia must not succumb to the abject, she must expel it to claim herself. The constant push and pull of living in this way means that a subject cannot atrophy, but neither can it rest. At pivotal moments in the novel, when the cancer is all-consuming, making my protagonist's old lives physically and mentally untenable, they find themselves transported to an alien landscape. The internal mutinous processes of cancer are reflected in the landscape and the text. I see this place as a stage outside of the symbolic, where fixity of self and life has been lost, where even signification fragments can no longer be sustained. Although they would rather not be here, it is an elevated place, numinous, a place of growth. Suffering as a root knowledge is not a new idea. Julia may not be the one physically suffering, but through her experience of disease, she becomes capable of a wingedness, which is not to suggest a saintly figure, an angelic vision in white floating closer to heaven, but rather a hard-born watering of ragged feathers, a new take on Plato's Phaedrus. And I would add here that the idea of this connection came because my husband and the character also in the novel has a tumor on his back, which grows and goes down as treatment succeeds and fails. And it made me think of growing a wing. That's where it came from. In this text, Socrates tells Phaedrus that in old time, the soul was entirely feathered, and that love is the optimum state for restoration of lost plumage. Through love, he said, the parts where the feathers sprout are softened, and true lovers eventually die winged and lightened. Caring for someone with disease, I would argue, also engenders a softening, albeit in different ways. And this softening can only be positive for the soul. In many ways antithetical to beauty, disease is not desire in a conventional sense, a Platonic sense. It does not offer a glimpse, an echo of the heavenly, namely a warmth that awakens the soul and stimulates plumage. However, just as the soul in Phaedrus undergoes a change like that of children when cutting their teeth, it boils and is sore and tingles as it shoots its feathers. Care too can bear its own gifts, lifting the veil of life to reveal a truth often hidden behind it. I'm spinning the Platonic idea on a love access here to embrace those close to death, those in touch with their own mortality. In this way, care reinvents love as, to quote Christiva, the union with the singularity that is completely other. And by loving here, she means a desire or willingness that the singular might be clarified, be recognized. Next slide. I am not discounting romantic love, which is not replaced but coexists within Julian. Romantic love has the potential to enhance the art of care and its benefits. But this kind of love, I would argue, is not necessary to care. Indeed, caring too much in that way can even impede the art of care. My novel is about a carer who happens to be a wife, but any carer who cares authentically, who has emotional investment in the life and death of the cared for in his or her singularity, has the potential to be transformed. And in loving the singularity of a person with disability, carers can be agents of change, not only for themselves, but for a wider community. If acceptance of singularity is a revolutionary ideal pointing a way forward, then care can become, according to Christiva, a political act, a means to transform the norms. Julian tells Alex's story, the story of a man in his prime, an illness, so that others know. She tells his story so that others can share in it, but she also tells his story to honor him and his singularity. On one level, this is achieved by giving her husband a voice, both as patient and person, sometimes through diary extracts, sometimes memory, sometimes imagination. On another level, it is achieved through the art of care. It is in Julian's efforts to care for, to preserve his singularity, to tear away labels that damage, that she truly honours her husband. I would like to transform how cancer and cancer patients are perceived, to create a new discourse about this disease. A cancer patient like Alex is colonised multiple times by the disease, by society's perception of that disease, and by the medical professionals who treat it. And we've been hearing about that already this morning. In telling her husband's story, Julian not only reclaims him, but she also goes some way towards healing a rift at the heart of medical discourse, a rift between body as object and body as subject. Medical discourse is dry, full of parching objectivity. It alienates, it clinicalizes. In its efforts to unify, to pin down, to stabilize, medical discourse shreds superfluity, shreds the singular. Throughout my husband's illness, I amassed a great deal of paperwork given to us by various medical professionals. And as we've just been hearing about the doctor's notes that were inserted in the previous novel, I also insert excerpts in my novel. I use them to show how they failed to tell a full story, conflicting them with the saturating emotionality of lived experience. I juxtapose, I splice, I play. And by these means, medical discourse can be disarmed, rethought, questioned, made new. I see the data, the facts of science as monuments of the symbolic and its drive to control, to explain, to know. Christeva lists scientific discourse as an example of monological discourse in which the subject both assumes and submits to the rule of one, God. This is the opposite of poetry. I don't wish to abandon Western medicine, putting in its place ignorance, chaos, or poetry, but to think about what is lost, absent, overlooked in its distribution. If we accept that symbolic systems are phallocentric and that medical discourse and practice as part of the machinery could be said to valorize masculinity as well as health, then Julian as woman is perhaps well placed to see or seek what is lost, absent, overlooked. For it is women, says Christeva, who should call attention to whatever remains unsatisfied, repressed, new, eccentric, incomprehensible, disturbing to the status quo. I'm conscious that not all women are outsiders in the system, and arguing that women possess a greater efficacy to effect societal transformation may risk generalization and hypocrisy. It seems unfitting for a theory expounding the merits of singularity to fall back on a binary, effectively a lack of singularity, i.e. men, women. But by woman, I'm not referring to a binary byproduct of the symbolic, but rather to woman as a source of that which opposes the symbolic, where no bias exists against the singular, where the singular is embraced conversely because plurality is embraced. Her knowledge originates in part in the pre-symbolic, the semiotic. This mode of being is of course open to men, and men can be equally attracted to it, but I suggest that it is more natural to women and that they have a greater need for it and a greater psychic potential to live more closely to it. Is it important that Julian is a woman? Perhaps. Carers, of course, are not exclusively women. The she in she wings is not meant to exclude, but to suggest that these wings in part emanate from a feminine that is porous, that has more fluid boundaries, that is more likely to find itself at the political front of care. All speaking subjects, says Christeva, have within themselves a certain bisexuality, and it is the feminine part that is subversion, signifying the possibility of an undoing, a redoing. The maternal and feminine, due to their diversity, says Luz Irigari, cannot be boiled down to a single model. I hope that my novel goes some way towards filling out, restoring an alternative, rehumanizing. The feminine seeps into Julian's narrative, which itself resists definition, being auto-fictional and a blend of genres, in the form of chaos, of feeling, of fractured subjectivities, of the poetic. Christeva describes woman as mother as a strange fold, a fold of culture and nature. I see the carer as a figure of folds, not the patient, not the medical professional. She is somewhere in between. Oftentimes, Julian finds herself literally and figuratively in between, trying to negotiate both the more raw emotion of her husband and the severity of medical discourse. Sometimes this necessitates a practicality when, for instance, one leg in each camp, she is compelled like a diplomat to make phone calls, acquire a hospital bed. Other times she hovers between the two realities, stretched, pulled to a breaking point by the knowledge of each. A cancer story is not simply one story, it is multiple stories. The story of a cancer, a patient, of medicine and care. In my novel, Julian is the fold that brings the multiple narratives together, her own story running in and out of them, between them, fluid. My novel gives the figure of a carer a voice and validates her knowledge. She shares the art of care and its gifts, and through a redefined love, she takes steps to preserve Alex's singularity and becomes winged. I'm aware that the ideas presented here may be attractive because they're compensatory, but hers is not a self-glorifying wingedness, but an excruciatingly honest cutting of feathers. I do not lay claim to any hardened truths in my novel, but what I hope to offer is an intervention on discourse, on the traditions of expressing experience, on the genres of care, and how they are framed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. I will now go over to the next speaker. So now we'll hear Vera Kasaseva, Aesthetics of Testimony, Voices of the Pediatric Cancer and Hematology Ward of St. Ursula in Wax Tablet by Franca Mancinelli. So Vera was born in Chelyabinsk in the Russian Federation, has a double master's degree in Italian studies by Bologna University, together with Russian State University for the Humanities in Moscow, and is an ex-collaborator at Centro di Poesia Contemporanea. She's also a member of the Russian Union of Literature. She's a poet and translator.
Thank you for this opportunity to participate in the conference. Auto-describing, my name is Vera, I'm 26 years old, I'm a Russian white woman with dark hair and I'm wearing a black shirt. I would like to present to your attention my research entitled Aesthetics of Testimony, Voices on the Pediatric Cancer and Hematology Ward of St. Ursula and Wax Tablet by Franca Mancinelli. Since the 20th century, characterized by multiple massive and individual traumas, the non-conventional literary form is actively developing around the world, and it is a prose of testimony. This prose based on autobiographical or historical material contains both documentary and aesthetically elaborated elements, which coexistence complicates the attempts to classify it according to the actual system of literary genre. It is a relevant research problem still unresolved that requires a particular critical reflection in the discipline of literary studies. In 2016, Centro di Poesia Contemporanea of the University of Bologna organized a very curious humanitarian art project, Parole necessarie, the necessary words, aimed at specific witnessing of medical space. A group of poets of Centro was integrated into the everyday life of the hospital St. Ursula, and one of the results of this project is a cycle of lyric proses, Wax Tablets by Franca Mancinelli, translated into English by John Taylor, which witnesses her experience in the pediatric oncological ward. The literary form of a Wax Tablet is of particular interest in the context of the literature of testimony. It cannot be classified as diary, as chronicle, or as a mere artistic prose. It is an open form, according to the definition of Mancinelli herself, a non-conventional new genre, which is a symbiosis of all of them. This research aimed to analyze the Wax Tablet in the context of its testimonial nature and try to understand the factors that have influenced its particular formal and heterogeneity. An attempt was made to define the literary form of Wax Tablet as a genre that meets the concept of new prose proposed by Russian writer Shalom Shalamov. Apart from the ambiguity of the genre attribution, a wax tablet has various artistic particularities that also magnify the effect of its formal openness. It is more evident, especially on the level of composition. The text of wax tablet is strongly fragmented. The prose is not ordered chronologically, and in the beginning we meet the protagonist, in which figure the Franco Mancinelli's guest, in post-faint conditions, whereas the episode of a very faint during her presence on child spinal tap will be explained later. The episode in a treatment room is followed by disconnected voices, the origin of which is not always possible to define. It could be statements of the author, the patients, their parents, or even of medical staff. For example, I can take 3 steps in one direction, 4 steps in the other. If I open my arms, I have all the space. I sit down, go back to my seat. I am a large closet in which you hang your breaths, winter and spring clothes, colored jackets, dark jackets. These lyric memories are always brief and extremely poetic that make me similar to the genre of prose poem. It is a dimension where the testimonies from the word assume an aesthetic function in the most obvious way. Besides, the plausibility of these testimonies is claimed by the multiplicity of their subject, and the position of the omniscient author in wax tablet is suspended. It is a space where everyone's truth was given the floor. Sometimes it becomes possible to identify who the voice belongs to. In this choir of witnesses, apart from the narrator, it is possible to distinguish 2 figures, of a mother and of Alessandro, Mancinelli's student who survived cancer. Still, there are only indirect identifiers to them in the text. For example, in this testimony, the figure of a mother could be guessed. Despite everything, he had grown, so I went out to buy him some new pants. As he stopped between the shelves to choose, I was struck by a thought bursting out. It's useless to spend a lot. He won't wear them very long. And the last discontinuity to mention is in the end of the story, when the narrator tries to go away from Sant'Orsola, and it could seem the conventional closure of the story, but Mancinelli betrays the reader's expectations again, and the narrator comes back to the pediatric ward. It creates a sensation of a cycle noticed of the author herself. Here, a circular force takes effect. The coexistence of beginning and end generates a strong current that forms a whirlpool. You cannot go away, you can only move off and return to another spot. A few steps and I'm back in the pediatric ward. This circular force reflects what Shona Feldman defines by the formula: the accident pursues the witness, and the witness is in turn in pursuit of it. The testimony is compulsive, and it is well reflected by the open form of a wax tablet. The last paragraph of the prose changes the picture drastically, and we see a young woman crying between the hematology and infectious disease buildings. A reader can suggest that the narrator finally went away from Sant'Orsola. Always formal heterogeneity of a wax tablet is not coincidental. It reflects the complex nature of a phenomenon of testimony. The challenge of witnessing that the poets of necessary words faced is not easy at all. Mancinelli described the accident faced by her in this ward in catastrophic terms. In my notebook, I collect the traces of a storm that drags on beyond every shelter. In the pediatric cancer ward, she encounters the material that cannot be settled into understanding or remembrance. She enters the space of pain where where everyday people face the illness and the death that may be the most unexplained and unnatural ones, the illness and the death of children. And the world of pediatric or oncological ward is quite hermetic. It is difficult or even impossible to admit its reality from outside. And this kind of negative experience as childhood cancer cannot be fully understood by a witness. Every testimony contains a lacuna, especially when the witness encounters death. And analyzing the nature of testimonies of survivors of the Shoah, Giorgio Agamben notes, the true witnesses are those who did not bear witness. Whoever assumes the charge of bearing witness in their name knows that he or she must bear witness in the name of the impossibility of bearing witness. This idea about the impossible mission of the witness is one of the leitmotifs of the wax tablet. And in this context, the opening episode of fainting during a spinal tap is very illustrative. It is a body that reacts first to the terrific. It is only a body that can give its silent testimony, assuming the lacunas to which the language has no access. And the first reaction of body is paralysis. And the central image of a wax tablet reflects well this corporeal logic. My body is a wax tablet. I was thinking of writing, and instead I was being written. I wear the marks of another alphabet, a language that we can modulate with closed lips, pursuing a trail of meaning. This quotation is emblematic of issues which a phenomenon of testimony poses. Apart from the theme of the importance of language, it reflects also Mancinelli's doubts about the agency of the author. In fact, the position of Mancinelli relative to the testimony is very contradictory. She is at the same time a listener, a participant, a witness, and these roles can also intersect with each other. As Dory Laub notes, the listener is a party to the creation of knowledge de novo. The listener to trauma comes to be a participant and a co-owner of the traumatic event. As a listener, Mancinelli enters the clinical dimension of testimony. Her listening has a psychotherapeutical significance. This is more articulated in the episode when the narrator listens to the story of resistance of Alessandro. Alessandro tells his story and being told by him. I don't miss a word, and yet I can't write it down. I am unable to bear the plot, but we have opened a canal, a waterway. His voice flows into mine. A magnetic tape closed up inside his body unwinds. His voice flows into mine. It is an artistic method a wax tablet is written by. It emphasizes also a profound transformation of a listener. Dory Laub notices, as one comes to know the survivor, one really comes to know oneself. All of this suggests that Mancinelli's testimony is not a mere testimony. It is more than that. And its poetic form is too ambiguous to be uniquely defined. However, a literary form of a wax tablet could be explained by one theoretical concept of new prose proposed by repressed Soviet writer Varlam Shalamov. Shalamov is a Russian writer, poet, and Gulag survivor, and he wrote a set of short stories, Kalma Tales, about his experience in the labor camp. Shalamov made a real revolution in the literature of testimony, but according to the definition of Elena Mikhalik, it remained unfortunately unnoticed. He also left behind theoretical and critical essays. In his theoretical work entitled About Prose, Shalamov defined a new prose as not the prose of the document, but the prose of the ordeal born out as a document. According to Shalamov, the gravity of the themes that new prose explores puts specific demands on the language of the author. And the author of new prose should write in his own blood. New prose denies the principle of tourism. The writer is not a spectator, he is a participant of a life drama and not in the guise of writer. It is important because of the necessity to transfer accurately the feelings and to keep the high level of credibility. New prose should transmit not information, but a heart wound. And Wax Tablet fully respects this principle. For the author of the Wax Tablet, as for the new prose writer, to write is not a mere artistic mission, but a moral imperative. And for the concept of new prose, Shalamov proposes a number of stylistic features. First of all, he emphasizes the importance of the authenticity, which could be achieved by not descriptive brief phrases, which would create an effect of presence. Certain parts of a Wax Tablet meets these requirements. They seem to be the scraps of conversations heard in the pediatric cancer ward, which make a reader feel in the thick of things. According to Shalamov, the authenticity also consists in imperfections, repetition, discrepancies. The authenticity itself requires a sort of mistakes. In Kalama Tales, he could confuse the name of characters, repeat the same story twice, or leave some words unfinished. The open form of Wax Tablet fully reflects this authentic principle, but its discontinuities, flashbacks, drastic shifts from one theme to another, the absence of conventional beginning and end. And secondly, referring to the textual position of the author, Shalamov denies his didactic presence. According to the concept of new prose, the writer should remember that in the world there are thousands of truths, and the strong polyphonic nature of the Wax Tablet confirms the many ideas on the role of an author of new prose too. And the author breaks the barriers between form and content, or rather does not understand the difference. It seems that the gravity of the theme itself is set in certain artistic principles, Shalamov writes, and the fanciful, resistant to conventional critical tools, the prose of Wax Tablet by Franco Mancinelli, is an organically appropriate way of expressing the complex reality of pediatric oncological ward and the testimony about it. Its experimental aesthetics meets the characteristic of a new prose fully that should combat the canonical writing in literature. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vera. Incredibly interesting. We are now moving on to our fourth speaker, Roxana Donsu. She is going to be presenting Sorana Gourien, Parallel Narratives of Colonization and Decolonization in Sorana Gourien's The Story of a Fight. Roxana.
Thank you. I'll try to share my screen now, see if it works.
Okay, I'm going to read your bio quickly so people know who you are.
Okay.
So Roxana graduated from the University of Bucharest with a degree in English and Russian studies. She completed her PhD in cultural and literary studies at the same university. She is currently a lecturer in the Modern Languages Department at the Karol Davila University of Medicine and Pharmacy in Bucharest. Her research interests cover areas such as post-colonial and post-communist studies, world literature, translation, and medical humanities. She is a member of the International Research Group on Literary Modeling at the University of Münster, where she has been invited to teach at the Graduate School on British, American, and Post-Colonial Studies. She has translated over 15 books from Russian, English, and German. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mona. And as nobody can see me now, I think it's proper to auto-describe myself. So I'm a white female in her 40s, in her early 40s. I have shoulder long red hair, green eyes, and I'm wearing a white blouse. Now the question is, can you see what I'm presenting?
Yes.
Okay, good. So A few words about the author. Sorana Gurian was a Romanian-French writer of Jewish origin. Her real name was Sara Gurfinkel. She was a member of a very famous literary circle in Romania, Zburatorul, led by Romanian critic Eugen Lovinescu. In Romanian, she only managed to publish 2 books, The Days Never Return and Occurrences Between Sunset and Nightfall. And in French, I'm sorry, I don't know French, so my reading of French will be a bit Les Mailles du Fier, Les Amours Impitoyables, and the last book, which we will discuss now, Récit d'un combat, The Story of a Fight. I have to say that all the translations are mine. The book has been published in French and translated into Romanian, but so far there is no English translation. So The Story of a Fight is a piece of autofiction which relates the author's confrontation with breast cancer, French hospital and French oncologic surgery and surgeons in mid-20th century, basically in the 1950s. The narrative of the fight is thus extended to comprise a double or even triple fight. The author's fight against the disease, her efforts to preserve the integrity of her body and to cope with the loss of one and then of both breasts, and also the fight against the chaotic and paternalistic medical system in which the patient's agency is close to nil. To say something about the book itself, its structure is rather traditional. It's divided into first stage, second stage, and third stage with an epilogue. This is a quotation from the first stage. Basically, the novel begins with her describing her bohemian life in Paris, in the Paris of the 50s. She's a writer working for the Édition Juillard and also a collaborator of André Malraux. She is friends with all the famous Romanian émigré writers in Paris, like Eugen Ionescu. But as she comes from the East, escaping communist Romania, she only has enough money to rent a cheap room in an old hotel from the Quartier Rata. After an episode of unexplainable malaise in the middle of a summer afternoon, which she describes as juicy and hot like an overripe peach, the idea of cancer is first suggested by an article about early cancer detection published in a weekly magazine, and then she begins to palpate her breasts, and then also by her family history. Her maternal grandfather dead of liver cancer, grandfather of lung cancer, father with kidney cancer, and then liver cancer. The quotation that I put here describes her fear, because this is what happens in the first stage. She is taken to hospital for a simple biopsy by a friend of her, very close friend, Raymond. And then she's anesthetized. She thinks it's just a biopsy, and when she wakes up, one of her breasts had been removed. So this is the story of how the breast had been removed. While she was sleeping and the doctor was waiting for the biopsy results to arrive, after the doctor found out that she had a tumor, the doctor had a conversation with her friend Michel, who was a psychiatrist, and the male friend said that he would take responsibility for everything and asked the doctor to remove one of her breasts. So this incident, of course, is at the basis of her revolt and also her mortification and her self-hatred as the result of the impotence she felt as a woman and as a writer when confronted with the shocking discovery that in threshold situations, it was still the male who assumed the responsibility and who held decision power over the female body. And in fact, after she wakes up, she receives the news of the breast removal surgery indirectly because the surgeon is afraid to tell her what he did. He tells her that he had been forced to perform an exeresis. And while she's wondering about the meaning of the word, she notices that the bandages were soaked in blood. And then, after the anesthesia wore off, she feels a crushing pain in her back. And to give you an example of the insensitivity of the medical personnel, the medical staff back then, this is what an intern told her after the surgery. They took everything out, your whole breast, the muscle, the axillary ganglia. They scooped out all the flesh on your ribs. To stitch you up, they had to pull the skin on your back. There was a huge mass of flesh in the tray. Of course, that parallel with the cancer narrative, as the cancer is slowly invading her body and turning her into a disabled person, she has to make sense of it, to renegotiate her identity. And this is very hard to do because she, in her youth, she had been a rebel and she's still a rebel. She was a political rebel. She was also a cultural rebel. So now she's just trying to make sense of everything that happened to her. In the second stage, when she discovers a second tumor, in her in one of her axillary ganglion, she starts to describe cancer as a form of imperialism. The second stage of my disease stands under the sign of fear in all its forms, from the most benign to the cruelest, close to dementia. The most harmless relate to coquetry. I was afraid of a mutilating scar, of an old visible fold, of a too long incision. The most atrocious came from the depths, incapable to escape from the domination of the animal terror of physical suffering. Fear made my teeth clatter, sent shivers down my spine, my body all covered in a cold sweat. Thinking of the cancer proliferating without my knowledge, establishing its colonies, feeding on the healthy cells, destroying my tissues, filled me with a nameless horror. The doctor who operates her tumor in the second stage and who is also taking care of her, although not operating on her in the third stage, is called Dr. N. All the doctors in the novel have this Dr. L, Dr. N, so that she, would keep the identity of the true doctors hidden. His voice was, however, authoritative, swift, admitting only short and to the point answer. He did not smile. He had nothing of that false and conventional politeness of doctors who think it is their duty to reassure their patients. And despite subterfuges, he went straight to the point. Under his gaze, you are literally dissolved. You are only that piece of meat which, with a gaze as firm as the first scalpel incision, he would cut off from your body. Once the diagnosis is made, he would abandon you like an old rag. In the third stage, while she discovers a tumor on her second breast and also uterine fibroma, a fibroma in the womb, she begins to slowly deteriorate. And I gave the example here, emaciated, my face gray, my cheeks lined with wrinkles. It seemed to me I was giving off the smell of a cadaver. I could not hate my body any longer. I was sinking with screw and load into decomposition. The mortal danger of chronic diseases is that they end up dominating and subjugating the spirit. I spent 6 months in a TB sanitarium, and I witnessed how several people, independent and decided in their former lives, were turning gradually into the slaves of their own thermometers, defeated not by the disease, but by the obsession of disease. And here I should add that before she died of cancer, actually in her youth, she had suffered from osteal tuberculosis, and she lost, let's say, some of the functionality of her leg. So basically, she was a cripple when she started being affected with cancer. And thinking back to what Janet said and Kristeva's definition of the object, we can actually think of the narrator as, the epitome of the object, as a Jewish woman from Eastern Europe and also disabled. So what she finds in this third stage, what she finds unbearable, in fact, is her impotence. Nothing is more atrocious, I think, than a feeling of impotence overwhelming you when tied to the steel table. You are nothing but a guinea pig crucified on the lab board. You cannot do anything either for your body handed over to unfamiliar hands or for your spirit enveloped in a vacuum. The anxiety is so intense that you long for narcosis. However, I vehemently refuse this artificial peace induced by substances. A too curious spectator of my own person, I had to see myself at all costs. And I did, miserable heap of viscera that I was, under the huge cyanolytic lamp not yet turned on, while they were fixing the belts around the ankles and the wrists. What she finds out in this third stage is actually, she finds out that she has still the power to fight the obsession of the disease with the help of a friend, also an oncologic patient, a Spanish woman called Katy. Together with Katy, she develops a strategy for resisting the disease. So from the first day, despite the fact that I had just suffered a demolishing operating shock, we started to live like two tourists on a beach that was called Rue Le Monde. We dressed up in the morning, we tried new hairstyles while sipping our teas, hers linden, mine mint, and then we moved to the bar. Sitting up among the pillows, we would imagine Saint-Germain-des-Prés or Saint-Michel Squares, the crowded cafe, the garçon with the tray, and talk as if the small marble table had been there between us. Wild laughter, more or less obscene jokes, small talk about fashion, politics, the marriage of Margaret of England, the divorce of Juliet Greco, and whatnot. So while she details all the psychological stages which accompany the gradual disabling of her body produced by an aggressive cancer, she also comes to terms with the thought of her imminent death. However, she refuses to give in to this kind of depersonalization operated by a patriarchal, highly technological and specialized medical system. So she tries to counterbalance the reification of personhood with this kind of diffuse and indeterminate femininity which springs from her friendship with Katy. And actually another strategy which I found interesting because it's not there in a lot of novels. It's the strategy of seduction, of seducing the enemy. During this last stage, one evening, she suddenly declared to Katy that she has a secret plan. What was the secret plan? She wanted to seduce Dr. N, the same who was the representative of a kind of medical imperialism. And of course, both she and Katy laughed. But when she started thinking about it, this idea gave her an enormous power. And I was thinking about seduction. I remember there was a Romanian philosopher, Gabriel Liceanu, who argued in a very small book on seduction that actually seduction plays an important part in the master-slave dialectic and is one of the techniques by which the human mind achieves domination over another person. It's a kind of soft violence. In Gurian, however, seduction becomes the instrument with which the subaltern, this cancerous woman patient, can free herself, at least spiritually, from the domination of the male technological order, whose representative is Dr. N. And also, Baudrillard has a book on seduction, conceives of seductions as a means of female resistance through its indeterminacy. Seduction is a kind of feminine strategy of resisting the male order of the law, the phallocentric order, which Baudrillard associates with the institutions of psychoanalysis and feminism. It's a bit debatable whether this is true or not, but what seemed to me obvious is that seduction actually was a strategy of resistance. So in the end, what can come as a conclusion is that the novel has two parallel narratives. One is a narrative of colonization. The cancer is gradually invading the body, crippling it, and finally killing her because she died 2 months after she wrote the book. And also a narrative of decolonization, of decolonizing the mind, because the narrator gradually develops strategies of resisting the depersonification inherent in oncologic care or in oncologic surgery at that time. So I would like to thank you for your attention.
Okay, so we've heard all the speakers. If you guys have any questions, so far in the chat, I don't see any, but please feel free to raise your hand. Oh, Beth, yeah, please.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks for some wonderful papers. I had a question that I think it could touch on a couple of the papers that are specifically for Caroline. We had some interesting things about, I think Janet described it quite beautifully. There's kind of this tension between this clinical objectification of the body versus a more kind of subject-oriented and perhaps more empathetic or rehumanizing, I think is the word that she used. So there's kind of a tension between two different ways of looking at the these kinds of experiences of the body. And I'm just wondering, and I think it also just came out in the paper that we just heard in terms of the doctor as the imperialist. But I'm just wondering with Caroline, you mentioned there's 3 different narrators, 2 of them being doctors and 1 of them as the patient. I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that and what the differences or well, probably no similarities, but if there are any, just wondering if you could speak to kind of how the body is viewed in light of these different ways of looking at it in terms of kind of more clinical and lacking humanity kind of versus this more kind of holistic understanding of the body.
Very much, Beth. So actually there's only 2 doctors that you hear. So you have the oncologist, Van Ardois, and he is actually sending letters to the GP. So the GP is the recipient, if you want, of the medical reports. So Van Ardois basically is described and in the way that he's interacting with the patient, by Cécile, as being very cold, very clinical, not letting anything transpiring. So there are several passages in the novel where she describes how, kind of medical examination being distant and being very painful. It doesn't take any, in French you would say, ne prend pas de gants, it doesn't really take much care in kind of doing the physical examination. And when he sends any reports to the GP, this is always in this kind of very clinical description, which I have to say, when I was reading it, I was kind of, I'm not even sure of what kind of medical examination he's talking about. And hence why I said that when I actually translated, I had to put some of it via kind of some kind of machine translation, just for a bit of help, because some of what I didn't quite know. But Van Ardois, otherwise, when he is referring to Cécile, so the kind of second voice that you hear, is very much talking about how he wants to break her and shape her. But this is the more fictional part that I was talking about, where he's actually a bit creepy when you read into it. You're thinking, oh, she doesn't have any idea in the novel that behind this kind of cold, very clinical, detached, almost a personal character that he's putting, his mask that he's putting on when he's treating her in the hospital. There is this kind of more human person who is falling in love with her, but doesn't show anything. And I think the first quote I put on the slide about him wanting to own her is more like the side that transpires throughout the book. So you really have those level of discourse where you have the discourse of Cécile, sorry, I forgot the name, Cécile, and how she's feeling being treated, how she feels she's perceived and being treated by the hospital and by Van Ardois in kind of very distant and cold fashion. And you've got then the 2 sides of the doctor in parallel, the kind of oncologist referring very clinically to what he's doing to the patient, and the kind of more human being, if you want, behind the doctor, but that is not supposed to show this facade, I would say, to the character. And this is probably, as I said, a more human side, but a more unsettling side of the doctor. I think you've read that, and then you're thinking, if I needed to see a doctor and you know that he's thinking about like that behind the scene, then you might be a bit reluctant to go over. So I don't really know if I've answered your question, Beth, but that's what I can say just now.
No, you've answered it perfectly, and you've also kind of, you were talking a lot about it, and it's all kind of coming together in my mind now. I just wanted to say one thing that you may or may not disagree with, but you're talking very much about how there was quite confusing language with that one narrator, and then with another narrator, you were really uncomfortable with it as a woman. And I'm wondering whether we could kind of interpret some kind of this discomfort on the part of the reader as kind of an intentional objective, and there being some kind of message there that she wants to express her own discomfort for that experience by making her readers uncomfortable as well. I'm just wondering whether that's like a potential.
Yeah, that's definitely something I considered, but I was careful not to go too far because I don't think I've had time to really think about it enough. This idea of how much of her own experience as a cancer patient in the 1980s has informed her and how much has filtered in the fiction. My impression is that probably she went through an uncomfortable experience and through this whole, I would say the 1980s probably was the climax of this kind of technological advance in medicine, which really created this gap between the human being and medicine as a science. And I suppose that after that, things have shifted a little bit and have got better there. But yeah, there is definitely this idea of how much of her is actually in Cecile, and you can see the connection. And I would even say that this insistence of the kind of the fact that it is a novel, that you've got roman on the cover, and then this kind of warning saying, you know, any resemblance, anything that sounds like it's me, it's not. I think this insistence on that reinforces my suspicion that actually there may be more in it. And another thing that I didn't mention is that actually, so she got Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1981, she got cured in 1982, and she got engaged in 1982. So apparently she didn't get engaged to the doctor, but there might have been some sort of courtship happening at the same, you know, a bit in parallel of the story there. So yeah, I was tempted to label it almost as an autofiction, despite the fact that there is the insistence that this is a novel. But then it takes us onto the territory of autofiction, and where does it start and where does it stop? But it was our wish to label it as a novel. But I suppose as the reader, there is this freedom of maybe not seeing it just like that.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other questions, or any of the other speakers who wants to jump in to what was just being said?
Hi, I've got a question for Womxn, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, you said that the work is set kind of in the 1950s, and it's about what it's like to have cancer in that time. But the way you're describing her is sort of timeless. Did you feel that the novel was, apart from the man making the decision for her, was it dated, or do you feel that it still has a lot to say about contemporary medicine as well?
Well, I'm not familiar. First of all, she had her experience of cancer in French hospitals, and I'm not familiar with French hospitals, although I am certain that they have changed a lot in the meantime. But there is indeed something, let's say, that transcends time barriers in the book, and that is actually the way she describes her experience as a woman going through all of this. She has a great sense of humor, but on the other hand, she's very honest. She's so honest that you cannot, as a reader, you cannot not identify actually with the author and what she writes and what she had gone through. What I can say, for example, is that her book may be valid for Romanian hospitals today. I'm not sure it's the same thing for French hospitals, but for our hospitals, for a lot of them, not all of them, probably her experience would be you know, the norm. Sorry to say that. That's why I was interested in the book. I don't know if I answered.
Yes, you did. Thank you. I'm making myself a little reading list from today. So I'll see if I can get a copy. Thank you.
Yeah, so Caroline, you raised your hand.
Yes, I have a quick question for Janet. It was really fascinating to listen to you after my paper and to see the kind of connection. And I was especially struck, and it kind of goes back to the question that Beth asked me. I was especially struck when you said that the character is you and is not you at the same time. And it goes back to what we were saying with Beth, and also this filter and this question of how much of the writer and of the author, of the person who has experienced either the illness or the care for an ill person, is actually transposed or is actually found in the novel. And I was wondering if you could say something about how you are approaching this filter, this layer, and how much of you are you careful not to put in or to put in. How do you approach this dilemma of almost of how much of you do you put in the narrative?
Yeah, it is an interesting parallel, isn't it? Because you know, I could write on the front of my novel, this is a work of fiction, but it's not really. I think you have to be very careful, don't you, about people being able to identify people. And I'm trying to, I don't use any names of hospitals or places or people, obviously, which is part of the motivation for making it also fiction, so that you can be anonymous. I think also I try to think about what my husband did want, what his family are okay with me writing. I have, you know, talked to them. I'm using some of his diaries. He was okay with that, but you know, you have to be sensitive about that. So there is stuff that I wouldn't write that is too personal. I think in my head there's been a complete merging of character and people, real people. And it was quite interesting. One time I sent a friend a message, I think it was around an anniversary or something, and I actually referred to my husband as the name of the character. and I didn't even realise I'd done it until I looked back, and it was obviously because I've been busy writing, and so the two names had merged in my head. The fiction in my work also comes through having license to be totally experimental in my writing. I'd say that is a large part of what makes it fiction, but there's no getting away from the fact that what happens to the characters is actually what happened, but part of the background is a little bit different. The histories of the characters are not the same in all respects. It's mostly real, if I'm honest, with a little bit of made up stuff. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Roxana, you raised your hand.
Yes. Okay, so I would have, maybe it's not a question, but a comment related to Vera's paper. I was pleasantly surprised to see Shalom Shalamov mentioned in the paper. And probably this piece of this essay that you mentioned about the new prose was written in connection to his experience in the Gulag. So I like the way you took this, experience of the Gulag, which is a trauma, like the experience of disease, and you connected, in a way, you connected this trauma experience with an aesthetic point of view. The commentary about the form and the content, that basically whoever has experienced the trauma, be it the trauma of an illness or the trauma of the gulag or any kind of trauma, does not really think of what content and what form to choose for the content that he wants to express, but that in a way the form is suggested by the content that she or he has to express. So thank you for this, idea of bringing in actually the aesthetics to judge what, as in illness narrative and in trauma, is in fact something that is not very concerned with aesthetics, but it's more like narrating personal suffering and making sense of something that is in a way meaningless. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much.
And I would also like to ask you if you have to, can you send me, does this article of Shalamov exist in English or only in Russian?
I found only in Russian this article. I tried to find in English, but
no. I know Russian. So if you can, I would ask you to send me this article, even if it's in Russian. My Russian is a bit rusty, but still.
Yes, it's no problems. Yeah? Yes, it's very big website.
I'll write my email in the chat here, and thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, it's now exactly 12:45, the supposed end of this panel. But if anybody has some last minute questions, I will be happy to take them. Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone. It was 4 incredibly interesting papers, and I think they worked incredibly well together as well, right? So thanks a lot, and see you in another panel. Bye.
So good afternoon and welcome to this session, which is session 3C of the Contemporary Women's Writing and the Medical Humanities Conference. And this session will be focusing on images of cancer. And I am Caroline Verdier. I'm a lecturer in French at the University of Strathclyde, and I am actually delighted to chair this session. I will briefly auto-describe myself before I forget. So I am a white woman in her 40s. I am blonde, wearing my hair in a bun, got green eyes. I'm wearing a black t-shirt and some silver jewelry, and I'm currently sitting in front of a bookcase. So we have 3 speakers this afternoon. For this session, we will each present a 15-minute papers, and we will keep all the questions for the end. As a quick reminder as well, I need to tell you that the session is being recorded, and if you do not wish to appear on the recording, please do ask your question using the chat function to ask your question anonymously. And if you have a question, feel free to put your question in the chat at any time, or if you want to ask your question on the screen yourself, just raise your hand at the end during the Q&A session, and I will pass over to you. So I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker, and then we can take it from there. So our first speaker today is Darian Goldenstahl, and Darian is an American research creation printmaker and bookmaker based in Montreal, Canada. Darian graduated with distinction from Concordia University's Humanities PhD program in 2021, where she held Canada's most prestigious graduate award, SSHRC Vanier Scholarship, and a dissertation, Body as book as body, the meaning making of artists' books in the health humanities, investigates how artists' books can become multi-sensory objects of lived experience on the topics of illness, disability, health, and well-being. In the fall of 2020, she will start a Bunting postdoctoral fellowship at the UNBC Northern Medical Program to continue merging creative health practices and health humanities. And today, Dorian is going to talk to us about the enduring lives of artists' book. Dorian, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'll begin sharing my screen, and good afternoon, morning, night, wherever you are in the world right now. We're all kind of scattered over the globe. My name, once again, is Darian Goldenstahl, and I am a white woman with light brown hair that's pulled back, wearing a kind of marbled orange shirt. I'm in a room with some very garish prints that I'm working on the wall far behind me. And I am an artist with an MFA in printmaking and a specialization in bookmaking. I'm actually currently zooming into you from Kelowna, British Columbia, where I am a Banting postdoctoral fellow at the University of Northern British Columbia Medical Program. My presentation today focuses on the representation of illness within the medium of artist books, which was the topic of my dissertation, Book as Body, the meaning making of artist books in the health humanities. All right, so what are artist books? First of all, artist books are an object of fine art that takes on and engages the format of the book conceptually and formally. These handheld artworks make use of text, image, touch, time, smell, and the gestures of turning pages to communicate a message within a one-on-one encounter. I first became interested in the medium of artist books when I began to collaborate with my sister, Dr. Devon Stahl, in 2012, some 4 years after her diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. Although I found I was unable to find the words to provide comfort to my sister in these initial years of her illness, I began making artwork about her symptoms and gifting these prints to her as a gesture of my care and empathy. And in return, Devon wrote and shared her illness narratives with me, as well as MRI scans of her brain and spine to incorporate into these artworks. As a printmaker, bookmaking is a part of my trade. I found that uniquely so, this medium held the most potential to merge our expressive practices of both my sister and I, her writing and my printmaking, into a singular object that easily outweighed the sum of its pages in expressive heft. After exhibiting these works together for my MFA thesis exhibition, my PhD research expanded to include how others employ this medium to elucidate their lived experiences of illness as well, and to discover how these objects might fit within healthcare contexts. To experience the breadth of artist books on illness for my research, I became a visiting scholar at the University of Kent and spent time with their prescriptions collection, which is a unique archive of artist books devoted solely to topics of bodily concern. Here is where I first encountered the work of Martha Hall. Martha Hall began to make artist books after her second diagnosis of breast cancer in 1996. Like my sister and I, Hall was similarly drawn to express her illness experiences through the medium of artist books, because of their ability to merge poetry and narrative alongside her hand-drawn and printed imagery. These books not only aided Hall in organizing the events of her life and the emotions that came with a life-altering diagnosis, but also became a method of sharing these difficult topics and subject matters with her husband and daughters. However, What makes Hall's artist books and practice truly consequential, and indeed what would become her legacy, was how she employed them in the clinical examination room and for medical education. For this portion of my presentation, I have divided her artwork thematically to address text, time, and touch. Several of Hall's books, including this one, Voices, 5 Doctors Speak, transcribe the conversations with her numerous physicians. Each of these physicians is distinguished here using a different typeface, although the sentiments they provide are strikingly similar. Lines read, "Let's find a place to talk. Between 6 months and 6 years. We failed, you failed." Hall brought these books into her appointments and insisted that her oncologists read it next to her before conducting their examinations in order to hear their words reflected back to them in the pages. This was Hall's method of beginning a difficult conversation around how she wanted to be talked to and how personally defeating it was to hear lines like, "You failed," within the context of her cancer treatment. Reclaiming and reprinting these transcripts turn the tables on who exactly was being examined here. By reading this book together in the clinic's room, Hall destabilized the typical doctor-patient encounter. I argue that committing these words to ink within the authority of the book as an icon within Western culture for knowledge gave Hall the authority to advocate for herself, which, given the vast power differentials between patients and doctors, gave her a necessary stepping stone, an object of attention between silent submission and the open two-way communication and partnership that Hall required. The next topic of Hall's books is time. In addition to forcing her physicians to spend time with her reading these books, many of Hall's artist books concern time thematically as well. She addresses the tension caused by tight clinical appointment schedules where the speed of medicine is shown to be misaligned with the priorities and abilities of the ill person. The durational aspect of her artist books, like this one, The Rest of My Life Too, evidence medicine's influence over time. This book was created by sewing together her medical appointment reminder cards collected during a single year of her cancer treatment. On the back of the cards, she chronicles her life as a patient and lists the things that she missed out on due to her cancer treatment, such as family reunions, coffee with friends. And while the text narrates the severity of Hall's illness, it is the sheer number of medical appointment cards from just this single year in her cancer treatment that communicates the gravity of her illness. Holding them stacked together, one can literally feel the cumulative impact of cancer treatment and its domination over time. Appropriating these cards and choosing to spend what ultimately little time she had left, transforming them into an artist book and bequeathing it to the medical archives, enabled Hall to gain back some authority over her regulated time, the purpose, and the meaning of her labor. Beyond the themes of time presented in the pages, artist books holistically inhabit time through the duration of their reading, as a tool for capturing an event or memory, enduring time as part of an archive, and resisting the forward momentum of time by making past lived experiences urgently present tense for anyone who engages with it, even well beyond the lifetime of its maker. Hall passed away from her cancer in 2003, but her artist books tell a story of her illness in her stead. Today, Hall's books are part of medical humanities curricula at the University of New England and several other institutions across North America. For those medical students who take the time to read her books, Hall's work not only educates them about the patient perspective, but also exemplifies that the very act of preserving time within the already overloaded curricula of medical school to be with and listen is in itself a strategy to counter the systemic pressures of clinical efficiency. Such a reflexive engagement with artist books has the potential to alert medical learners to temporal disparities experienced by patients and ultimately apply more accommodating communications with their future patients. And finally, touch. Perhaps what makes artist books the most impactful is for the students to touch and be touched by the handmade book. Exponentially more than a machine-produced book, there is a real sense of the craft lovingly devoted to producing and sewing together each page for you, some person in the future who is called to be present with this story. And I cannot overstate how much more real, literally tangible Hall's experiences become when one is able to hold and spend time with her artist books. In my time in the archives, I found that handling these books was far more emotive than I had even anticipated. I had viewed these books online prior to visiting them in person, but touching them engaged a level of emotion that had remained untapped before this moment. Feeling the creases and turning the pages, it was as if these books were a time machine or a talisman that transported me alongside Hall and all of her anger, sadness, and love behind these works. The feeling that this object was carefully crafted by the hands of a person who has died, who had so little time left, but chose to spend it making this object for you to experience and learn from, gives them a power to evoke compassion and empathy through any time, distance, and mortal plane. In medical education, Hall's books provide a safe object of attention to openly discuss these difficult topics of death and dying. Instead of having to talk about their own experiences, which may feel too personal or unprofessional, students can focus on the numerous complex facets of illness that are contained within Hall's books. Here, there's no pressure to save or cure the patient. They can simply listen, feel, and be with her. Hall's bookmaking practice and patient activism serve as a case study for the potentiality of artist books within clinical and pedagogical contexts. Emerging from this research, my Banting postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Northern British Columbia's medical program will solicit intrepid makers in rural, remote, and interior British Columbia to learn the art of making books, and then form small editions of their very own artist books on a topic of bodily concern. I will then archive a collection of these books and place them within medical institutions for future medical learners to experience the stories of people who are, in all likelihood, very different from themselves, but will represent the broad diversity of patients they will ultimately encounter in their practices. Following Hall's lead, I also argue for further integration of the medium into medical humanities pedagogies, because artist books not only give an authoritative account of what it is like to be chronically ill that is otherwise absent from medical textbooks, but they also provoke critical dialogues that scrutinize Western medical paradigms at the root of patient and practitioner discontents alike, such as stifling hierarchies, the speed of medicine, and the suppression of natural emotion. I aim for this project to contribute a substantial philosophical and pragmatic model for integrating the reading and making of artist books in medical and health humanities contexts. Spending time with first-person artist books, hearing their stories and engaging the senses in the co-creation of their significance is a potentially transformative practice of countering the depersonalizing effects of modern medicine. And it is only when we reclaim the time of being with others and invite those with lived experiences of illness to become partners in understanding health, illness, dying, and well-being that the health humanities will succeed. And thank you. If you would like to talk to me further about anything that I brought up in this talk, please email me. It's just my name @gmail.com, or visit my website for further reading and examples of more artwork. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darian. That was an absolutely fascinating paper. I'm sure there will be many questions after we've heard all the papers. So now let's move across a few time zones and join Beth Kearney in Australia now. So Beth is a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland, where she researches feminist deployments of photography in women's life writing in French from 2000 to the present. And she serves as well as a communication officer and postgraduate representative for the Women in French Australia, a sister association of women in French in the United States and in the UK. Beth's cross-disciplinary research is primarily anchored in the fields of modern and contemporary literatures, cultures, and visual studies in French, and she specializes in the interaction between photography and the written words, as well as in feminist philosophy and aesthetics. The floor is yours, Beth.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you, Darian, for that formidable paper. It's very it was very well thought out, and you articulated things really beautifully, much better than I ever think I could. Thanks for that. So I'll I'll auto-describe myself. I'm a white Australian woman with brown hair, and I'm wearing a green top today, and I'm in my office, which is very dark. It usually has a lot of natural light, but it's midnight here, so unfortunately not. Because I'm tuning in from Australia, I would also like to pay my respects to the First Nations peoples. I'm on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people, and their lands never were and never will be ceded. And I acknowledge all spiritual ties to country. So I'll get right into it, and I'll put my timer on. So Lydia Flem is a Belgian writer, psychoanalyst, and photographer. In 2008, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she underwent chemotherapy, treatment, and surgery. In her autofictional novel, La Reine Alice, which I've got an image of here, and this title, for those who don't speak French, translates to Queen Alice. So in this work, Flem imagines herself as Alice from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And she uses the character of Alice to write about her personal experience of surviving breast cancer. She discovers, of course, that it was not at all fantastic to enter into the House of Mirrors, the House of Mirrors being a metaphor for the medical environment in which Flem received her treatment. So Flem's novel very often evokes Alice's corporeal suffering during cancer treatment, as the heroine exclaims, to give you just one example. I'm infinitely sad. I no longer recognize myself. I've lost my smile and my good spirits. I've lost everything, my hair, my appetite, my strength, my sleep, my pen, my cat. I say my body or my sleep, but they no longer belong to me. They are no longer at my command. I'm not even sure that I'm able to use the word I. So this citation evokes, among other things, the fact that Alice's regular writing practice was affected by intellectual, emotional, and corporeal fatigue. These unhappy words furthermore evoke the fact that through the challenges of treatment, Flem lost her sense of self to such a degree that her breast cancer testimony could only be written in the third person, that is, through the alternative identity of Alice in Wonderland and in the House of Mirrors. For Flem, fantasy and imagination were avenues for escaping from the reality of treating breast cancer. and in a sense, they were avenues for self-care. But Flem only wrote this novel after she had recovered from cancer treatment. Because writing during treatment was quite challenging for her, Flem accessed creativity and imagination by taking photographs. And this was a practice through which she found she was able to invent a thread of fiction to find her feet again in reality. And just a quick note, these are all my translations. To my knowledge, there's no existing translation of the book. So they might not always be perfect translations, but there you go. The writer cum photographer, in a sense, survived her cancer treatment through resilience built from creativity, fantasy, and humor. That is, through her imaginative engagement with the apparatus that she playfully names the light catcher, or in the French, la trappe lumière, which you can see she spelled out in this photograph she took in the image on the left. So the series of photographs taken during this traumatic period would later be published in this volume called Journal Implicite, which translates to Implicit Diary. So in my paper today, I examine aspects of Flem's autobiographical novel and a number of her autobiographical photographs. I would like to make two main arguments about this corpus. So first, I would like to look at how she offers a wholly embodied perspective on the cancerous body, or on her own cancerous body. And second, I would like to show that this embodied perspective offers a subtle and light-hearted comment on the medical environment and how it may sometimes be ill-equipped to respond to the holistic needs of its patients. And this is an idea that's emerged many times throughout the conference already, even the first day. So hopefully I'll have something relatively original to contribute here. To begin with my first point here, Flem's work indeed reveals a very nuanced perspective on embodied subjectivity because she uses her text and image to expose an interconnectedness between vulnerability and vitality, so between death and life, and between inertia and creativity. So the life-sapping events and the life-giving events. So this complex perspective on the body and on subjectivity is what I draw attention to in the title of my presentation, which emphasizes at once the vitalities and the vulnerabilities of the cancerous body. So in developing this perspective, I borrow from the writings of Rosie Braidotti, and in particular her conception of life itself as encompassing both intellectual life as well as biological life. So we already know, I'm sure, that embodiment theory argues for an understanding of the interconnectedness between the mind and the body. But what Braidotti brings to this approach is a view on biological or animal life, or what she calls Zoe, which is a conception that radically reinterprets the typical opposition between life and death. So Braidotti associates notions of vitality and perishability, and she conceptualizes the shifting boundaries between life and death. So although life and death are typically framed as dichotomous concepts, they may also be considered as ontological states that would not be possible without one another. Death necessarily bookends life, and life would not be life without the certainty of a definitive death. Being alive indeed means existing as matter that shifts, transforms, and decays with time. Being alive means existing as a dynamism of matter and cells. And Braidotti writes that the being aliveness of the subject is identified with the perishability, its propensity and vulnerability to death and extinction. So according to this perspective, death is always inscribed in the dynamism of lived experience. So this perspective on embodied experience corresponds well to Flem's portrayal of the cancerous body, as she associates the creative and dynamic moments of her lived experience with the most challenging aspects of her cancer treatment, such as when she feels fatigued and disorientated, or when she contemplates her body without any hair at all. That is, Flem acknowledges her bodily suffering and expresses exhaustion, pain, and disorientation, but she connects these challenges to the beauty and dynamism of life itself. This is really an astoundingly positive view on the challenges of cancer treatment. And in La Reine, for example, we read that it is up to everyone, thought the turbaned woman, and that's just a playful nickname that she gives herself because obviously she was wearing a scarf around her head. So it is up to everyone to tame bad luck, to add to it a portion, if only a very small portion of luck. And similarly, in an interview in 2016, Flem states that I think that mourning, separation, illness, the moments when we are fragile in life are moments that can be creative. So this positive and life-affirming perspective on bodily suffering is evident right throughout Flem's novel, as her protagonist finds joy in the present moment, beauty in daily life, humor and lightheartedness in imagination, and ultimately comfort in the creative practice of photography. Not only does Alice attempt to read and philosophize, but she also has conversations with fantastic characters inspired by Lewis Carroll's universe, and has conversations with objects such as her camera or her pen. So this positivity and resilience also emerges in the photographs that Flem took during treatment. So in this self-portrait of Flem, for example, she has lost all the hair from her head and she appears fatigued. Despite this visual display of her corporeal changes during breast cancer treatment, she invests theatricality and humor into the image. She wears lipstick and eye makeup and playfully adorns her head with a crown of ivy leaves. She thus exposes her bodily condition while also displaying theatricality and playfully evoking the idea that she is a queen, or a woman that has caught the queen of diseases. So to briefly provide a second example, I interpret this photograph as a memento mori still life composition. So here Flem creates a still life form through her inclusion of flowers and fruit, but she also incorporates a more personal memento mori motif, which is a stethoscope. So a medical instrument that evokes the photographer's fragility and her sense of her own mortality at the time of taking the photograph. In the original French, the image is titled Still Life au Stethoscope, which translates to Still Life with Stethoscope. And although the title of the photograph is technically in French, Flem chooses the English term still life over the French translation, which is nature morte, which would literally mean dead nature. So this borrowing of the English language is significant, as she writes that these are not dead nature, but still life, they're living pictures. And this was in the catalogue of photographs that she wrote that. So rather than evoke the notion of death through the term dead nature, the title Still Life au Stethoscope uses the English language to shift the emphasis to the notion of life, ultimately exhibiting positivity and resilience in the face of hardship. So for the remaining minutes of my presentation, I'd like to explore the implicit message that I think emerges from Flem's perspective on the vitalities and vulnerabilities of the body. And more specifically, the questions that I ask are, why does Flem choose to balance disquieting reminders of death with positivity and resilience? And what does this mean for how we interpret her portrayal of the medical environment? I'll get straight to the point here. And I'd like to show in the next few minutes that Flem's work may be read as an indirect and lighthearted comment on the way that the medical environment may not be able to fully meet the holistic needs of its patients. And specifically, I'd like to show that it is the metaphor of the house of mirrors and the way that it is deployed throughout the novel that work to evoke Flem's regular sense of disorientation within the hospital environment. So for example, the novel describes the figure of the white rabbit, who I think connects in a sense with what Darian was saying about time. So the figure of the white rabbit from Lewis Carroll's universe in Flem's universe is actually a doctor who is constantly chasing time by racing between patients. Similarly, Flem's protagonist appears quite confused and disillusioned each time her regular doctor or nurse changes, and she sometimes mistakes one person for another. So although many of these characters prove to be kind, wise, and supportive, Alice very often feels alone. She sometimes feels as though she is drowning in her own tears or eating strange pills, and her body changes in rapid and unexpected ways. Some medical experiences are more concerning than others, such as when Alice has her blood taken by a character called the Red Queen, who is unsympathetic to her pain and tells Alice that her body belongs to science, that she is no more than a disease to be studied, rather than a human to be helped. So such elements of Flem's novel are not only playful adaptations of Lewis Carroll's fiction. These elements implicitly critique the fact that the hospital environment can confuse and bewilder patients. And these messages are conveyed in her photographs and her text. So although in this instance, the patient's body is receiving excellent medical care, Alice feels constantly disorientated and overwhelmed, and her moments of lucidity are quite rare. Breast cancer treatment is aggressive and traumatic, such that one would imagine that the patient's psychological, emotional, and interpersonal health would need significant attention as well. But these more holistic approaches to medical care rarely emerge in Flem's testimony, and instead, her work foregrounds, first of all, that a hospital environment is confusing at the best of times, and second, that the patient, who is already experiencing a degree of hardship, is poorly equipped to manage the complexities of the medical situation. But this is why the metaphor of the House of Mirrors makes sense. It allows Flem to lightheartedly express that from the moment that she fell through the mirror, that is, from the moment that she discovered the cancerous lump on her breast, she found herself in a dreamlike and upside-down space, as is represented in many of her photographs and described in this citation. She says, barely awakened from this absurd dream, she plunged into an even more disturbing world where everything was not just topsy-turvy, but symmetrically backwards. Running breathlessly, she could not move forward one step. When she finally thought she had progressed by one square, she found herself well behind. What should be left was right and vice versa until all ordinary points of reference were blurred. It was extremely uncomfortable. So this idea of the hospital environment as a house of mirrors foregrounds the fact that it was Lydia Flem who found within herself the resilience and positivity to survive treatment in good spirits, namely through her creative and regenerative practice of photography and through the fantasy and imagination that allowed her to access. Self-care in this scenario is useful and necessary, but it points to a larger problem. And I'll use Lizzie Ward here, who is a scholar of care ethics. So Ward writes that the concept of self-care is a tool that fits neoliberal economic imperatives to place responsibilities for health and welfare firmly with individual citizens. So that is, self-care belongs to a kind of neoliberal discourse that shifts the responsibility for care from society and onto the individual. By understanding self-care as a potentially negligent concept, we may read Flem's breast cancer testimony as a comment on the fact that she was often alone in her efforts to combat psychological, emotional, or interpersonal hardships that accompany breast cancer treatment. We may argue that Flem good-naturedly assumed the responsibilities of the medical institution in many respects. So I'll conclude very briefly. I think I have 30 seconds to do so. Today I've looked at how the cancerous body may be understood or is represented in Flem's testimony in terms of both its vulnerabilities and its vitalities. And this is a positive and embodied perspective on experience. And I interpret it as a comment on how medical environments operate. While they do their job by responding to the purely physical needs of their patients, they can fail to address their holistic needs. On this, embodiment theorist Rosemary Garland-Thompson argues, however, that by pointing out the unjust tensions between individuals and their environment, there can be a kind of explanatory power. Perhaps then, Flem regains a degree of autonomy through this explanatory power, ultimately using her breast cancer testimony to foreground her own exceptional, inspiring resilience in the face of hardship. So that's my paper. There's my works cited. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Beth. That was truly interesting and enjoyable to listen to you talking about Lydia Flem. So now we're traveling back to Europe, I believe, and we are joining Adina. So Adina Stroya is an early career researcher in the field of women's life writing and visual culture, and she holds a PhD from King's College London, and is a former visiting fellow at the Centre for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing at the IMLR in London. And Adina's research focuses on psychoanalysis, thanatography, aging, queer studies, ethics of the care, and visual studies. Our most recent publications include Camille Laurence, L'écriture depuis soi in Dalhousie French Studies, and The Traumatic Structure of the Récit de Mort, Camille Laurence Philippe, in French and Francophone studies. Her ongoing project investigates representations of aging female bodies in French, in contemporary French literature and visual culture through the prism of ethics of the care. And today's paper by Adina is Battling Cancer and Cinematic Genres in Valérie Donzelli, La guerre est déclarée, 2011. Over to you, Adina.
Thank you very much for that. So first, to also describe myself, I'm a white female. I'm currently wearing a green sleeveless dress. I'm wearing glasses, and I'm sitting in a red chair in front of a white wall. So I'd like to thank Ben and Becky for having me today. The work I'm presenting today is very much work in progress, so I'm trying to tease out where I'm going with it. I'd also like to preface this by saying that in keeping with the medical theme of the conference, I've been plagued by a series of medical issues this week, so I'm currently still quite ill, so bear with me. I hope my presentation makes sense, and if you have any questions, I'll do my very best to answer them. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Okay. So Battling Cancer and Cinematic Genres and Valérie Donzelli's La guerre est déclarée. Too quick. So in the year 2020, as we are being blindsided by a still ongoing global pandemic, my good friend Igor Reiner, a Proust scholar and distinguished pianist, was undergoing cancer treatment for recurrent Hodgkin's lymphoma. In a beautiful text published by Ashprand Salon, entitled My Present Illness, Fragments on Proust, Cancer and Death, he placed together his experiences of illness with ruminations on the Proustian oeuvre. I wish here to hone in on a passage which touches upon the relational configurations that illness sets up in our lives. Because we don't know how to suffer, during my transplantation, I struggled alone in my uncreative white hospital room. My mother was by my side, but because I learned that suffering is a private matter, I did not cry in front of her, or at least tried not to. I did not do so because I knew that my suffering would have triggered or amplified her suffering, and for some prudish reason, I restrained myself from letting my suffering surface the way it should have, as shouts, cries, weeping, screams, things being broken. I behaved. I pulled myself together. I didn't lose it. I wrote it down. I didn't call any of my friends to tell them off for allowing me to suffer alone. I did not do it because it was not reasonable or accepted. I did not do it because I was taught that this is not their responsibility. And besides, what could they have done? Suffered alongside me? Were they not suffering already? It was this particularly moving passage that turned me towards the line of interrogation I wish to broadly pursue today in my analysis of Valérie Donzelli's movie La guerre est déclarée, Declaration of War in English. The central issues I seek to address relate to the multiple perspective illness forces us to have as patients, as those who are atteints, touched by illness, and as those attending to them. For me, the most salient point in Igor's writing was the triangular scheme that was set up by the framework of illness between himself, cancer, and his mother. Following this, a series of perhaps uncomfortable questions are woven through today's discussion, though I will by no means be able to answer or touch upon all of them. Namely, I am wondering, how is the burden of suffering distributed? How do we translate illness and the possibility of death, not just for the other, but also for the one in whose body it has taken residence in? Shifting perspectives, today's paper looks at how a mother interacts with her child's cancer, as well as represents it. But unlike in Igor's case, the son remains unaware of what has taken place in his body due to his very young age. La guerre est déclarée deals with the cancer diagnosis, a brain tumor, of 18-month-old Adam and the ways in which his parents, Juliette and Romeo, played by former real-life couple Jérémy El-Kaïm and Valérie Donzelli, and the ones around them, are mobilized in supporting his treatment. The movie is directed by Donzelli from a script that she and El-Kaïm co-wrote based on their real-life experiences of dealing with their son's pediatric cancer. The militarized metaphors surrounding cancer are writ large. La guerre est déclarée. And this leads me to wonder what happens when the territory to which a human being can be reduced for a medical diagnosis belongs to someone who, in the blissful ignorance of childhood, remains unaware that they are being invaded, who then takes on the right to bear arms. Gentilly declares war on cinematic genres in La guerre est déclarée. The first difficulties when discussing the movie arise when one has to generically qualify it. For what does one expect from a movie about a child with a brain tumor? Dramatic labels immediately seem to huddle together in our imagination. As Les Enrocs justly asks, est-il un genre plus glissant que le film de maladie? The generic slipperiness of the film gave rise to a series of inventive reviews, which offer a variety of takes depending on the critic's point of view, as well as on personal allegiance to or preference for a particular genre. Les Enrocs call it a tragédie miraculeuse. Téléciné-Obs called it un film d'amour et d'action. And the New York Times talked about it as a manic sprint, a perilous carnival ride. And of course, this makes my task all the more difficult. For to call a movie a dramedy or a tragédie comique would be doing it a disservice, as the movie is built, as you can tell, through the pendulum movement of genre. So I will go with an amalgam of the most often countered descriptions. I will call it ni a comédie, ni a tragédie. Tragedy plus time does not equal pure comedy in this particular case, but the movie remains audacious, not only in inviting it in, but in making a home for it. As Gentilly herself states, oui, j'aurais moi-même beaucoup de mal à qualifier le film. Je ne pense pas que ce soit une comédie dramatique, ni un drame ou un mélodrame. Avec le recul, on se dit avec Jérémy El-Kaïm que c'est juste un film physique, intense, vivant. The movie eschews pathos by avoiding a grating question one often encounters in Hollywood productions and beyond, which is perhaps rooted in the Judeo-Christian logic, wherein punishment and guilt are at the fore. Why me? Gentilly adds another dimension to the movie by layering in the parents' own awakening, Juliette et Roméo's. Je voulais montrer comment ce couple passait de l'insouciance de la jeunesse à l'âge adulte. Je tenais également beaucoup à évoquer la réalité de l'hôpital où nous avons passé tant de jours et de nuits. La guerre est déclarée is a movie that is both mature but also set in the kingdom of childhood and youth, as the parents are propulsed into adulthood by the unforgiving specter of potential tragedy. And I would like to show an excerpt from the movie that best illustrates the points I have just made, as well as the ways in which Gentilly deftly blends the gravity of the situation with humor. Gentilly is well aware that there is no clear answer when it comes to her child illness, for as we know, the pathogenesis of cancer is extremely complex. The disease strikes for all sorts of reasons, which often remain unknown. Child cancer implies a complete dissolution of metaphor. In a critical climate that emphasizes the ways in which pain, and I would add loss and the potential for loss, resist expression, Gentilly demonstrates that the lived experience of potentially losing her child demands instead multiple forms of representation. Throughout La guerre est déclarée, she shows us that cancer contaminates, infiltrates, and multiplies. And she does so through a variety of means. First of all, montage techniques, which are collage-like, in which we imbue the movie with different rhythms that mirror the ways in which illness uproots all fixed points de repère, as well as any perceived linearity. The movie has a referential quality. It is highly citational. And as Tim Palmer notices, Gentilly's cinematic playfulness points to another deeply embedded affliction, this time of an artistic hue, cinephilia, a cinephilia that he goes on to read as rampant in contemporary French cinema, a defining rule of the game. She also uses a sound such as an eclectic soundtrack, which ranges from Laurie Anderson and Sébastien Tellier to Vivaldi, There are the couple's own musical moments, which are indebted to French musicals, in particular those by Jacques Demy, as well as more contemporary productions, such as Les Chansons d'Amour by Christophe Honoré. We also have voice-over narration from 3 different characters, and there are also different forms of layering. I'll talk about the opening shot that you can't see, but I'd like to avoid any other technical issue. So in the opening shot, we see a nurse walking towards the mother and the child, and she is shot at ankle level, and it is we hear the clacking of the shoes, and this changes the cliche perspective of the clinical space. The cinematic medium is plagued with shots of this long défilé of lights on the ceiling from the point of view of the patients, but we are brought down to earth for low-level shots, perhaps hinting at the young age of the patient when he was diagnosed with cancer, when he could but crawl due to his affliction, and his vision was also affected by the tumor. And this opening scene cites Gaspard Noé's Irréversible through sound and the chromatic palette. It's extremely loud. Noé's film used a particular sound design which used infrasound and lower frequency, which further disturbed the viewer. We see the child as a 9-year-old, and then we go straight into the mind's eye here to where it all began, to the party where Romeo and Juliet met. So we'll quickly shift from the opening, which represents the coda, the outcome of Adam's illness, for we know he survives and progresses out of infancy. And the violent lighting that we see, if you ever get to see the movie, also cites Noé, and is reserved to their meet cute, and the stroboscopic lighting is also a reference to a coup de foudre, a lightning bolt, which are in contrast with the draining clinical colors. And the scene is reminiscent of Xavier Dolan's 2010 hit, Les Amours Imaginaires. I have no idea whether there was any overlap in the sense that she could have seen the movie at Cannes before production. I'm not sure when production started. But the movie is most indebted, however, to the Nouvelle Vague. As Isabelle Régnier remarks, it is permeated with the spirit of the new wave. It is set in opposition to big Hollywood movies, and borrows extensively from the new wave through techniques such as dolly shots, jump cuts, and extensive use of wide outside spaces, Parisian and otherwise. Not much time in the movie spent in the domestic space, underlining just how little time they had with their child before the clinical space, as well as this toing and froing, took over their lives. The movie is influenced by Truffaut-esque insouciance. We see the couple joyously running hand in hand across the bridge immortalized in Truffaut's Jules Légime. It's exactly the same bridge, the Valmy Railway Passerelle in Charenton-le-Pont to the east of Paris. And this marks the beginning of their life together. The movie ends with a shot that visually echoes Truffaut's famous final scene in Les 400 Coups. It's visually identical, but it is shot a few miles west of Truffaut, still in Normandy, but at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer instead of Honfleur. She borrows heavily from Godard's color palette, who had a particular a penchant for reds and blues, and this ever replicating citational character of a certain area of independent French cinema became most apparent to me, considering that the movie it most reminded me of was actually a 2017 movie, Michel Hazanavicius's Le Redoutable. There's also heavy use of voice-over narration, which is used at various turns in order to liberate the visual material. And these dissonances present in the movement offer formal representation of the experiences the parents and the child are traversing. And the kingdom of the ill and the kingdom of the healthy are divided, as Susan Sontag has famously put forward. These cognitive and affective states are also encompassed by this duality existent in voiceover narrations, where the parents have awareness of the disease, but it is Adam's body who experiences it. And Gentilly has very neatly separated the domains of lived experience, if you are to follow her declaration on her son's relation to the movie. Il a adoré participer au film, mais il ne le verra pas. Il ne faudrait pas que ce souvenir se substitue à la fiction. The child, now of age, may have a very different take on the matter, but it is my belief that the ludic tonalities of the movie are an offering to the real-life son, Gabriel, giving him a panoramic view of the early years he spent in the clinical setting. Lacking the tools to acknowledge his condition through his very innocence, the child had remained unaware of the uninvited and undesirable guest that had taken residence in his body throughout his illness. For La Guerre déclarée, the child not only knows that the parents bore witness to his disease for him, but that they declared war and won. Thank you very much for your attention. And sorry for the technical issues.
Thank you very much. And now, don't worry, we had plenty of time, and it's probably the nature of technical issues to happen each time. You don't want them to happen there. So, thank you. So thank you for our three speakers for three fantastic and very rich papers. And we have quite a lot of time for discussion. So I'll just open up the floor to the discussion just now and to questions. So you can I'll just remind people that you can either raise your hand, use the raise your hand button if you want to ask your question live, or you can post your question in the chat. I'll make a start then. It was really interesting to see some commonalities between the few papers, and I wondered if you could tell us, the three of you, or if you want to tell us a little bit more about. I think it's you, Beth, who described the betrayal of the medical environment, and I think this is also something you mentioned in a way, Adina, with this idea of not being a lot in the domestic space and a lot of time spent in the hospital. And Darian, I wonder if this is something that has also been in your experience, this idea of, the place, the hospital, and the influence it has.
Darian, would you like to go first, or Adina? I don't mind.
Whoever wants to go first.
I'm still thinking.
Oh, well, I have an answer. It's very different from a betrayal. Gentilly is very generous in her portrayal of the medical space. They're all very efficient. And she actually went and shot the movie in the real life locations. She even invited some of the staff to participate, but none of the doctors refused because he said he was a very bad actor. It's interesting to see from an American perspective, for instance, because I was reading a review in the New York Times today, and it underlined that the movie never makes any reference to the catastrophic bills that the couple is going to face following their child's illness. It's interesting that they absolutely completely got lost in translation, that France has a more socialized, socialist a healthcare system, and that it won't leave you bankrupt or worse should you be severely ill. So I think it's quite a generous portrayal of the medical space. They spent a lot of time there, and they show you all the kind of real life intricacies of being in the medical space, and everyone is very supportive. So it's a positive portrayal for once.
It's quite interesting. It seems to be quite different from what happened in the adult world. Then maybe it's the kind of pediatric perspective versus maybe the adult perspective. So, yeah. Ariane?
Yeah, I was having trouble with this word betrayal because I'm not sure if Hall would have characterized her experiences as a betrayal or more of an indignity. A lot of her writing talks about having to undress in public, in front of strangers, lie down, become almost like an infant, just doing everything you're told in this kind of very paternalistic manner. So I would say that her practice was a method of gaining back a sense of dignity for herself, that I'm taking control of the situation and you are going to sit down with me and hear your words reflected in this book because what you said to me, I can't stop thinking about. And it was very hurtful. And maybe for you, this is an everyday occurrence, but for me, this is extraordinary. And I need to remind you to be careful and to treat me with utmost respect. And I'm just always floored by her practice and the sense of self-advocacy she had. And I really think that it was creating these books that gave her the bravery to start these conversations, because these are the people charged with saving your life. And it's not an easy thing to critique them to their face. So by having this object saying like, no, I'm going to read you this book and it's the book that's actually critiquing what you're saying. And you can like hear yourself in this. It was this necessary kind of mediating object that then led to more open communication to gain back a sense of dignity and respect and two-way communication.
Darian, you're really helping me think through some of my ideas and some of the things that I've struggled with in my own work here. And just before I kind of respond to the question, I'm wondering, like, it's almost just with what you said then about how she has the words and she kind of conveys this experience to the doctor so that the doctor can have some sense of objectivity on their own language and some awareness of that. It's almost like Hall it's like an act of generosity. She's saying you can be aware of how, like, it's very giving. And again, we come back to this thing that I think, this idea that we're all very familiar with, is that a lot of the time the people that are suffering or who are kind of in a more compromised position, they find themselves caring for others, trying to reassure the people around them that, you know, that they're the ones putting out all the energy in order to make things okay. And that kind of comes across in this gesture of her communicating to the doctors how they can help her more. But yeah, I don't know whether you'd agree with that or not. I'll try and, sorry, you go.
I totally agree. And I think, you know, in the art world, critique is a generosity. It's showing that you care enough to actually tell someone how you really feel. So I think that is a practice fine artists do all the time that may be seen as very confrontational to other disciplines. But you're exactly right that critique is coming from a place of love and generosity.
So I think this balance between being critical and being very soft in the way that you deliver that is actually something that I've kind of struggled to interpret with reading La Reine Alice, but is really kind of making sense to me now through this discussion. Just in the sense that I knew that kind of, as I was saying, there's a lot of metaphor and there's a lot of implication throughout the photographs and the text. That's the whole thing. The whole thing is through this prism of fantasy. So because it's so like funny, like she's cracking jokes the whole time pretty much, like the white rabbit being the doctor just constantly chasing after time. And there's this really strange scene where she's like, oh no, I think I'm about to faint. And he's like, it's okay, Alice, I'll put you on my back. And he runs to the emergency room or somewhere. And there's this doctor who she calls the white rabbit and she's on his back, and you know, it's just absurd, and that's like a joke in itself. And so you're like, is this a criticism or is this just a bit of fun? But I think that for me, it kind of, that's why I came to this idea of Rosemary Garland Thompson talking about the explanatory power. So through lightheartedness and through beauty, so that's kind of a lot of the things that you're looking at as well, Darian. Like, it's very beautiful and it's very emotional. And kind of through this more positive spin on things, that's how we get to this kind of sense of empowerment. I guess once you're pointing out the challenges, but and yeah, this idea of portrayal is really interesting in the sense that she points to the betrayal in a sense where, but also she points to the ways that that medical environment comes through. But through all of it, she tries to gain some degree of autonomy through all that. Yeah, I don't know whether I answered the question, but yeah, lots of things to think about.
Thank you to the three of you. It's really fascinating to kind of see those different perspectives on the medical environment there. Lucy, I can see you've got a question on your go. If you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, this is really interesting. All three papers. Thank you. I think this. I'm not quite sure how to formulate this as a question, but it's something that I sense from all three of the papers we've just heard. The thought first occurred to me when listening to Darian talking about the craft in the making of books, and it made me think of votive offerings in a way. And from there, towards the end, you were talking about the indignity of the patient experience and reclaiming some dignity. And so I wondered if the making of work about illness has quite a lot to do with catharsis. That's the catharsis, perhaps the thing that joins all three presentations together. But as I say, I really don't know how to ask a question about that. I suppose I just want to know what you think about that. Sorry.
I love the idea of this votive, because I do see artist books as this object that you are offering to other people that will kind of live on for forever. You can place it in a certain spot for others to see, to experience, that is meaningful. And it says so much about the person who left it there. So for Hall's practice, she bequeathed her artist books to medical schools so that medical students can learn from them for forever. Even 20 years on, today they're still used in health humanities courses, even though she passed away in 2003. So I love this idea that the artist book is a kind of votive, that this offering of an object for others to hear, to listen to feel the emotion and of the person who offered it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, this is actually a theme that is pretty directly treated in the book that in La Reine Alice that I was talking about. Because she talks about how, because she's a writer, she's been a writer since 1985 or something like that. And she talks about, well, there's a character in the book, and it's La Plume, so it's like her pen. And she has conversations with it, and she says, I just can't keep up with you. Like, I'm too exhausted. I just can't do it. So she kind of has this, so she personifies her pen, and she talks about how she just can't keep up with it. And that was a really traumatic thing for her, that expression, she didn't have that catharsis, she didn't have that coping mechanism with her every day. And that's when she chose to take the photographs. And in my PhD thesis, I actually kind of focused more specifically on photography itself, and how one really important aspect of photography that was really helpful for her was that she can take photographs instantaneously without much effort, and she does it with her smartphone. So in terms of, so she talks very much about this satisfaction of taking photographs and creating something beautiful and being able to reflect on life in that way that didn't sap her energy to such a large degree as writing or writing a novel, for example. So I think the power of creativity as a regenerative and cathartic force is completely key to understanding this book, I think, totally. Thanks for your question.
And do you want to add anything on that? Or?
Well, I think that it's not necessarily cathartic, but much has been made about the fact that it's an offering to people who may have gone for the same experience. And I think the fact that it's a visual medium also really helps, and it's really driven by emotion. It's not a movie that's very linear. The rhythm is very cassé, broken, and it really kind of grips the viewer. It's an easy watch despite the subject. In terms of cinematic genres, autopathographies, if you can call this an autopathography, aren't very common. I couldn't really find any other examples. So if anyone thinks of sees a movie about children with cancer, you know who to reach. But it's more common. Discussions of pediatric cancer are more common in literature, but unfortunately, they go into the sphere of the récit de mort, of death text. So it's not a very happy ending. As people in French will know, in the contemporary French sphere of literature, Philippe Forest is perhaps the best example, who lost his 5-year-old daughter to bone cancer. I think it started in the arm, and he's written several books about it. But in the sphere of children who survive, I haven't really found anything.
Thank you very much. Is there any further questions for our speakers? Well, I might ask another and abuse my position as the chair of the panel. And I was really interested as well, Beth, you mentioned this idea of the need for a holistic treatment. And it is true that in many of the illness narratives, and the one I was talking about this morning, there is no space for this holistic treatment of the patient. It's very much biomedicine and technology. And I was wondering, Darian, if you could say a bit about the importance and the role of art and the type of project that you are leading and that Hall was doing for this kind of holistic care of the patient. And I don't know if Beth and Adina would have anything to add to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, this all started with the collaboration with my sister, who was diagnosed with MS, as I said in my presentation. And I think it was so hard and so difficult a topic that we just avoided it completely in our family, which I have a lot of shame about now. But it was almost like it was easier and maybe for the best to just pretend like nothing was wrong and to put on this happy face and, you know, have so much hope and optimism. But actually that was denying her reality. And it was telling her, actually, these strong emotions that you're having, which I'm sure that you are having, though I haven't asked, maybe just don't think about them. Which is impossible to do. So she wasn't even getting holistic care from the people who loved her most. She wasn't getting holistic care from medicine, who treated her very much like an object. She has illness narratives of being sexualized as a patient, I think especially as a young woman going through the medical system, having to undress all the time, going into the MRI machine and having your entire body exposed to men on the other side of a glass wall and seeing everything about you, and then making disparaging comments. I mean, these are very traumatic moments that she was having. that I didn't know about because I didn't ask, because I was just trying to make things seem fine. But as soon as we had this other language to talk through the medium of art, it opened up a door that was shut. It was just too hard to talk about, but we could share images about it. So her sharing her MRI scans with me, and then me layering those MRI scans with impressions of my own body to try to create like this shelter for her exposed viscera using my own skin. Like, these are the kinds of images that we work with together in our collaboration. So I was then able to provide so much more of caretaking through this medium of art, and finally providing her a bit of holistic care that had been missing. It wouldn't have happened, I think, for a long time without this mediation of the art and being able to open up the door through a medium that doesn't involve language. Then opened up another door for language later. Like, then she started writing about it and sharing those narratives with me. And then I was finally able to hear her voice, which I had been denying previously. So the arts played this crucial mediating agent to like what Beth was saying earlier, to kind of tangentially talk about things through metaphor, through this translation of the visual. And then we were able to openly talk about it and provide caretaking from a family that was missing previously. So I think allowing people, giving people the opportunity to learn a medium, to express themselves through their own art making method, is what I'm hoping to do with my postdoc, and teaching people how to make books, and then like giving them the reins to express themselves however they want, whether that's text, image, collage, painting, photography, bound up into this object. I think will open up a lot of then more honest conversations.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Beth, Dina, I don't know if you want to add anything on this topic.
I think Darian gave a really wonderful answer, so I wouldn't want to spoil that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's kind of making me think like, yeah, it just goes to the point, like such a valuable perspective to share in the conference, Darian. There really needs to be other systems in place in a hospital, you know, like art therapy, for example, could be just another. And I think I think a lot of the papers that I've heard today, or maybe I'm imagining it, but they really speak to this need for something to just fill the gap, to make the experiences of the patients just that a little bit more supportive in all of the ways that they need. Making them feel like they have an avenue to report, comments that aren't welcome, and then some level of preparation for what they're going to go through as well. I think it also makes me think about, I have a family friend who's a psychiatrist, and so deals with, very intense, like traumatic engagement constantly as a part of his job. And I talked to him about, I was like, well, how do you it must be so hard for you. And the thing is that like, I think that this wall that a lot of doctors may have stems from this idea that they actually feel like they can't fully engage and fully, it's a protective mechanism in itself. And it sounds like, if I'm understanding correctly, what your family was going through is you were also really, really struggling yourselves. And it's much easier for you to not ask how things are going, because it's very, the response is going to be really terrible. And it's almost like doctors are kind of constantly doing that in order to keep doing their job. So they need self-care, but that's why we should think about the medical experience as being something that has these spaces or these initiatives that just really take the, like specialized initiatives that take the burden away from, that help the patients first and foremost, but that also make it a little bit more acceptable that the doctors aren't the empathetic, compassionate people that they kind of ideally would be. I don't know whether I articulated that very well, but yeah, really, really wonderful perspective, Darian.
Thank you very much. Is there is there any further questions or comments that anybody would like to make? We still have slightly less than 10 minutes, but if there is no more comments or question, I think we can leave our speakers to rest. Maybe Beth is going to be happy to switch off for the night. No? Nothing else? Okay. Beth, Darian, Adina, is there anything else yourselves would like to add, or?
No. Would you mind if I try to show that clip?
Of course, yeah. I think we still have a little.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Let me try and
everybody's happy to do that. Yeah.
Once it's very short. It's 1 minute long. Just 1 second. I think anyone who's lived in France, and particularly in Paris, will understand this very well. Hope it works.
Juliette! Ça alors? Ça fait un bail! J'en reviens pas, je pensais à toi l'autre jour. Ah, oh c'est drôle! Qu'est-ce que tu fais là? T'habites dans le coin? Oui. Moi aussi, enfin peut-être, je viens de visiter un appart, je vais peut-être acheter un appart. Ah oui? Tu sais, l'autre jour j'ai croisé Michel. Ah, et toi, tu vois toujours Annick? Non, on s'est perdu de vue. Oh, c'est trop bête. Faudrait que j'organise un dîner d'anciens, ce serait marrant de tous se retrouver. Tu sais que j'ai eu un petit bout. Un petit bout de quoi? Ben un enfant. Ah, et toi aussi, je crois. Oui. Oh, mais c'est génial! Et il a quel âge? Il a 2 ans. Comme Léo, exactement. Et il s'appelle comment? Adam. Oh, c'est joli. Mais ça va le tien, il est pas trop malade? Parce que moi, Léo, avec la crèche, c'est un petit peu la galère. Bah en fait, s'il a un cancer. Oh là là, c'est horrible. Qu'est-ce que tu me racontes? Oh ma pauvre, mais comment tu fais? Mais comment vous en êtes aperçu? Il est né avec, c'est héréditaire? Non. Mais vous ont quand même donné une explication. Non, il n'y en a pas. Mais forcément. Ben non, tu sais, il n'y en a pas, ça peut arriver à tout le monde en fait.
Vous pouvez m'expliquer ces 4 253 € de découvert?
Oui. Manger au restaurant que chez moi et faire des cadeaux.
So that was the little clip, which was a very Parisian rencontre on the street. And it really shows the way in which people can't really conceive that there's no particular cause to the cancer. And I find it really interesting that I was talking about their passage into adulthood, because her friend keeps pinpointing all these like major steps we take in life to be considered adults: buying a flat, having dinner parties with your old friends now that you're established yourself in life, having a child, and having all these worries about the children. And then I think nothing says adulthood like having a child with cancer, and that stops her dead in her tracks. And I found that really, really interesting, that it encompassed a lot of the points that Gentilly was making in the movie.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And now we got there in the end, so that was nice to be able to see the little clip. Well, if there are no further questions, I think it just leaves us to give a big round of virtual applause to our 3 speakers for really a fascinating session. And it was lovely listening to the 3 of you and to have these rich discussions afterward. I'm sure everyone is going to take a lot away from that. So thank you very much to the 3 of you. And I think this is drawing today to a close. And we shall be starting back tomorrow morning with a plenary by Amalina Damley from 9:30. So everybody, thank you very much for your questions, for listening, for your wonderful papers, and have a lovely evening or afternoon or a day wherever you are in the world at the moment. Thank you very much. Goodbye.